Trauma room was still laughing when the dying man opened his eyes. Crushed arm, no pulse below the elbow, and a chief surgeon already calling for amputation tools. Every doctor in that room had made their decision. Every resident had nodded along. The charge nurse had already reached for the surgical tray, and then a quiet blonde nurse, nobody had ever bothered to learn the name of, stepped forward from the back of the room and said, "Stop. The arm isn't dead." The laughter came fast. It stopped faster. Because the man on that table, a decorated army commander with blood soaking through 3 layers of gauze, turned his head, found her face across the chaos, lifted one trembling hand into the air, and held a perfect military salute. Then he whispered, "Chief, I knew you'd find me." Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who stays until the end of a story, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about people who were written off, counted out, and treated like they didn't matter. Stories that will wreck you in the best possible way. Hit like on this video and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every single comment means something. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The shift started at 6 in the morning, which was the same time every shift started for Lena Voigt, and she was already 3 minutes late because the elevator at Hargrove County Medical Center had been broken since Tuesday and nobody had fixed it. And the stairwell on the east side smelled like something had died in the wall. Pushed through the trauma bay doors with her badge still unclipped and a half-drunk coffee going cold in her left hand, and found the board full. 12 rooms, 9 patients already assigned. A yellow tag on room 4 that meant someone had been waiting since the night crew. Voigt. The charge nurse, Patricia Dunn, didn't look up from the assignment clipboard. Room 7's been flagged. Possible DVT, 62-year-old male. Room 11 is yours again. Post-op from yesterday. And room 4? Not yours. Lena looked at the yellow tag anyway. "It's been up since." I said, "Not yours." Patricia finally looked up, and there was nothing personal in her expression, which somehow made it worse. "Dr. Marlowe's team has it covered. Stay in your lane this morning." Lena had been hearing some version of that sentence for 6 weeks, pulled her badge on, tossed the coffee, and went to room 11. The man in room 11 was named Gerald, 71, recovering from a bowel resection, and he had pulled his IV line loose sometime around 3 in the morning, and nobody on the night crew had noticed. The sheet beneath his arm was damp and slightly pink. Not an emergency, but close enough that it should have been caught hours ago. Fixed the line, changed the dressing, checked his chart. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had spent enough time in hospitals to know which nurses actually looked at chills and which ones were just moving through the room. "You're the quiet one," he said. "Most people are quiet at 6 in the morning. No, I mean every morning. You don't talk to the others much." She wrapped the tape around the IV anchor and pressed it flat. "Talk plenty. Not in the break room." He adjusted his pillow. "I hear them, you know. Through the wall. The younger doctors, the residents. They do impressions of people. Last week, they did one of you." Lena kept her hands moving. "Was it accurate?" "I didn't laugh," Gerald said. That was his whole answer. She finished the dressing and updated his chart and moved on, because that was the job. And the job didn't pause for the feelings it gave you. 8 o'clock, she had rotated through 6 rooms, administered 2 medications, flagged a potassium level that the resident on duty initially dismissed before looking at it more carefully, and then quietly agreeing with her, and helped wheel an elderly woman through a hallway that smelled of floor wax and recycled air while the woman gripped Lena's wrist and talked about her daughter in Phoenix. Hargrove County Medical Center was not a prestige hospital. It was a regional trauma center in Dunmore, Montana, population 63,000, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and a 2-lane highway that connected it to the rest of civilization. Kind of place where helicopter transfers to larger facilities were common, where the trauma bay handled everything from ranch accidents to highway rollovers to the occasional hunting injury that got ugly. Kind of place where a nurse with a particular set of skills could vanish into the background if she wanted to. Lena Voigt wanted to. She had been hired 6 weeks ago through a standard application process. Her resume showed 4 years of civilian nursing across 2 hospitals in different states. Did not show anything before that. The hiring manager had not asked. The background check had cleared. She had taken the trauma floor rotation because it was the shift nobody else wanted, which meant she was mostly left alone, which was what she needed. She was 32 years old. She was 5'6", with light brown hair she kept in a braid. She had a small scar on her left forearm that she never explained, and hands that moved with a practiced efficiency that occasionally made the newer residents uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite name. She had never once mentioned the army. She did not intend to. At 9:47, some radio crackled, and the trauma bay doors came open hard enough to bounce off the wall, and two paramedics came through fast, with a gurney that had blood on 3 of its 4 wheels. The man on the gurney was large, broad shoulders, mid-50s, wearing a civilian jacket over what looked like a dress shirt that had been cut open by the paramedics. His right arm was wrapped in field dressings that were soaked through completely. His blood pressure on the incoming monitor read 78/50. His pulse oximetry was showing 89%. He was dying at a medically manageable rate, which was the worst kind of dying, because it felt like there was time and there wasn't. Dr. Raymond Solis, Hargrove's chief trauma surgeon, was already gloved and moving toward the gurney before it stopped rolling. He was 51, silver-haired, precise in his movements, and he had a reputation for correct decisions made quickly. "What do we have?" he said. Not a question. A demand for information. Male 56, found at a vehicle accident on Route 9, about 14 miles out. Passenger door collapsed inward on impact. Arm was caught between the door frame and the seat. They had to use the jaws to get him out. The paramedic rattled it off fast. Lost significant blood at scene. We packed it, but couldn't hold pressure. No pulse below mid-forearm for at least 40 minutes. Solis was already unwrapping the field dressing. The arm beneath it was wrong in several ways simultaneously. The forearm was swollen to nearly double its normal circumference. The skin had gone from pale to a mottled gray, and there was a tourniquet above the elbow that the paramedics had applied correctly and tightly. No distal pulse, the resident on call, Dr. James Farr, confirmed, pressing 2 fingers to the wrist and then the palm. No capillary refill. How long total? Solis asked. 40+ minutes of confirmed zero perfusion, the paramedic said. Maybe 50. Solis looked at the arm for 4 seconds. 4 full deliberate seconds. Then he turned to the scrub nurse. Let's prep for amputation. We're not going to save the limb at this point. I'd rather save the man. The room moved. Surgical trays came out. Residents repositioned. The documentation nurse started typing. Lena had come through the trauma bay because room 3 was 2 doors down, and she needed to check a post-procedure dressing, and she had stopped just inside the doorway because something about the patient's positioning had snagged at the back of her mind, in a way she couldn't immediately name. She stood at the edge of the room and looked at the arm. Tourniquet was above the elbow, correctly placed, correctly tightened. The forearm below it was swollen and gray and pulseless, and on paper, the picture read exactly as Solis had called it. 40+ minutes, no perfusion, tissue death progressing. Except, she looked at the angle of the swelling. It was wrong. The edema was not distributed the way ischemic tissue death distributed itself. It was concentrated high on the forearm, almost into the antecubital space, asymmetric in a specific way that pointed to a specific cause. She looked at where the tourniquet sat. Tight. Too tight, maybe, for what the arm actually needed. The brachial artery ran along the medial aspect of the upper arm, and the tourniquet had caught it perfectly, which was correct for controlling hemorrhage. But if something else was also occluding the artery above the tourniquet, then the compression had been doing double the work, and the tissue hadn't gotten any blood, not because the arm was dead, but because 2 separate forces were strangling it from 2 separate points. She crossed the room. Stop. Her voice came out flat, and even, not loud, not panicked. It cut through the room the same way a certain kind of voice cuts through noise, not by being the loudest sound, but by having no uncertainty in it at all. Solis turned. Everyone turned. The arm isn't dead, Lena said. The room was quiet for 1 beat. Then Dr. Farr laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. Exactly, it was more automatic, the way you laugh when someone says something that doesn't compute. 2 of the other residents exchanged a glance. Patricia Dunn, who had come into the bay to assist, pressed her lips together. Solis looked at Lena with the expression of a man who had been interrupted at the worst possible moment and was deciding how to respond to it. Nurse Voigt, room 7 is my assignment. I came through because I need to access room 3. She kept her voice level. I'm looking at this arm, and I'm telling you the tourniquet created a vascular false positive. There's a hematoma compressing the brachial artery above the tourniquet. That's why you're not getting a pulse below the elbow. Tourniquet is doing exactly what a tourniquet does, and something else is doing the same thing 3 inches above it. Farr shook his head. We checked above the tourniquet. You palpated. Yes. A hematoma that deep won't give you a surface finding. You'd need imaging. She looked at Solis. Portable ultrasound. 5 minutes. If I'm wrong, you proceed. Solis looked at the arm. He looked at Lena. He looked at the clock, which showed that the patient had now been in the bay for 6 minutes and losing ground the entire time. Dr. Solis, Patricia said carefully, we're past the window for. Get the portable ultrasound, Solis said. Farr started to object. The perfusion time alone. I said get it. It took 3 minutes to wheel in, and Lena stepped back to let the tech operate it, because the last thing she needed was to be any more visible than she already was. She watched the screen from where she stood. The tech ran the probe along the upper arm, above the tourniquet, adjusted the angle twice. The image showed it clearly. A significant hematoma, a pocket of blood the size of a golf ball, pressed hard against the brachial artery from a lateral impact injury that the field dressings had never reached. The artery was patent. It was intact. It was simply being physically crushed by accumulated blood that had nowhere to drain. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Farr was staring at the screen. That's compressive hematoma, Lena said. The tourniquet made the distal pulse disappear, which made the presentation look like a non-viable limb. Arm isn't dead. It's blocked. Solis stood very still for a moment. Then he turned and began issuing a completely different set of orders: vascular, decompression, drainage, careful release of the tourniquet in staged increments once the compression was addressed. Lena backed toward the door. She almost made it. The man on the table moved. It was a small movement, the kind that shouldn't be possible given his blood pressure and pain levels and the sheer amount of sedative the paramedics had pushed into his line. But his right hand came up, the damaged arm with the swollen gray forearm, and it rose with unmistakable intentionality into the air above the gurney. Salute. Old. Formal. The kind with the thumb tucked and the fingers flat and the wrist locked at the precise angle that gets drilled into a person until it becomes permanent muscle memory. His eyes were open. Barely. But they found her face across the width of the room with a focus that had no business existing in a man at 78/50. His lips moved. She was too far away to hear it, but she could read the shape of the words because she had heard them before, in other rooms, in other circumstances, when the world had been considerably louder and considerably more dangerous. Chief, I knew you'd find me. She did not move. She did not salute back. She stood in the doorway of the trauma bay in her hospital scrubs, with her name badge clipped at the collar, and she held very still, and she felt something in her chest tighten into a shape she had spent 2 years trying to dissolve. She recognized him. She had not expected to, not here, not in Dunmore, Montana, not in a regional hospital, 40 minutes from the nearest major road. Recognition didn't ask for permission, and it didn't wait for convenient timing. Colonel Marcus Webb. Not a commander, a colonel. Special Operations, 2nd Group, out of a classified unit that officially processed paperwork out of Fort Carson, but operated in places whose names never appeared on paperwork. He had been her commanding officer for 14 months. She had pulled him out of a vehicle wreck before, actually not identical to this one, but close enough that the muscle memory had kicked in before she consciously recognized his face. He had promoted her to chief warrant officer in a ceremony that had 7 attendees, none of whom were allowed to photograph it. She had not seen Tim in 2 years. She had not seen anyone from that unit in 2 years. That was the point. She stepped back into the room. Not to the bedside, she stayed near the wall, but she stopped retreating. Solis was already into the decompression procedure, working fast and correctly, now that he knew what he was actually dealing with. The team had reorganized around the new diagnosis, with the professional fluidity that good trauma units develop over time. Farr had stopped laughing. Nobody was making eye contact with Lena. Patricia Dunn crossed the room and stopped in front of her. Her voice was quiet, but her face was not particularly kind. You need to go back to your assignment. I'm not in the way. That's not the point. You're not part of this team, Voight. You inserted yourself into a surgical decision without authorization. Dr. Solis may have used your suggestion, but that doesn't mean. Colonel Webb is stable, Lena said. The decompression is working. You can see it in his color already. Patricia looked at the patient. The mottled gray in the forearm was very slightly, visibly changing, not pink yet, but less dead-looking. Something was moving through the tissue again. His name is Marcus Webb, Lena said. He's 56, no known drug allergies, and he's got a titanium plate in his left tibia from a previous injury that doesn't show on his intake paperwork because it was placed at a military facility. She paused. His blood type is A positive. You have O negative in his line right now, which is compatible. But if you've got APOS available, you should switch. Patricia stared at her. I know him, Lena said, because it was simpler than explaining everything else. That's all. She left the trauma bay and went to room 3 and checked the post-procedure dressing and updated the chart and did not let herself think about what was happening in the room 2 doors down, or about the salute, or about the fact that Marcus Webb's presence in Dunmore, Montana, was almost certainly not a coincidence. Almost certainly. She finished room 3. She moved to room 4, the yellow-tagged room that Patricia had told her to leave alone, and she stood outside it for a moment before deciding that a yellow tag was a yellow tag regardless of who had told her to stay away. Pulled up the chart on the wall tablet. 68-year-old female. Admitted for evaluation of chest pain. Currently ruled out for cardiac event. Being monitored for potential PE. Dr. Marlowe's team had ordered the standard workup. Patient had been waiting in room 4 since 11, the previous night. Lena went in, introduced herself, took a look at the woman's leg swelling in the right calf that was hard and warm in a specific way, and pulled up the last D-dimer result, which was elevated enough that someone should have been more concerned about it than the chart indicated they were. She was in the middle of flagging this finding for immediate review when her pager went off. Not her unit pager, the other one. The one she kept in the inside pocket of her scrub jacket and had not told anyone about because she had not expected to ever need it. Because the whole point of being in Dunmore, Montana, was that she was not supposed to need it. She looked at the message. It was a sequence of numbers. It looked like a serial number or a room code to anyone who didn't know what it meant. She knew what it meant. It meant eyes on you, 3 minutes outside. She told the room 4 patient that she was going to flag her chart for immediate escalation, which was true, and that someone would be with her shortly, which she hoped was also true. She updated the chart in the hallway, handed it directly to the first senior resident she passed, and said, Room 4 needs a D-dimer recheck and a lower extremity Doppler. Today, not tonight. The resident started to say something. Today, Lena repeated, and walked toward the exit. The ambulance bay on the east side of Hargrove County Medical Center had a concrete overhang that sheltered the loading area from the weather, and in the far corner of that overhang, where the camera angle from the parking lot security system didn't reach, there was a man sitting on a metal bench in plain clothes, reading a newspaper that he was definitely not reading. She had known him for 8 years. Staff Sergeant Devin Park, 39 years old, dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, scar on his chin that he had gotten in a place she was not going to think about right now. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, jeans, and he looked completely ordinary, which was something he had spent a career learning to do. You couldn't have used a phone, she said. Phones get logged. He folded the newspaper. You look good, Chief. Don't call me that. Old habits. He stood. He was a couple of inches taller than she was, and when he looked at her directly, there was none of the lightness that the greeting had implied. Webb wasn't supposed to be on Route 9 today. His schedule had him in Billings until Thursday. Someone moved him. Someone moved him. Park glanced toward the ambulance bay entrance. The accident wasn't an accident. Lena absorbed that without changing her expression, because she had learned a long time ago that changing your expression in response to information was a luxury that specific situations could not afford. The vehicle? Rental. Rented under a name that doesn't exist. Found 30 meters off the road with front-end damage consistent with a side impact. Somebody ran him off Route 9 and then left. He paused. He was coming to find you. Why? Because something came out of the archive, Park said. Something that was filed under your name. Medical procedures, classified operations, decisions you made in the field. He looked at her steadily. Someone pulled those files, Lena, and they didn't pull them to read them. Pulled them to use them. The wind off the Montana mountains came through the ambulance bay, and it was cold even in September. And Lena stood in it and thought about 2 years of quiet. 2 years of Room 7 and Room 11 and resident doctors who did impressions of her in the break room. 2 years of successfully being nobody. Who? She said. We don't know yet. Webb was coming to brief you personally because he didn't trust digital comms. Park reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, actual paper, handwritten, and held it out to her. He had this on him when they found him. She unfolded it. It was her name, her current address, and a date. 3 days from now. Below that, in Webb's handwriting, tight, forward-leaning, the handwriting of a man who had spent 30 years writing fast in bad conditions, 3 words. Don't trust anyone. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. How bad is the arm? Park asked. He'll keep it. She said it with the certainty of someone who had personally prevented it from being otherwise. He needs at least a week, probably longer before he's mobile. We don't have a week. He does. She looked at Park. Whoever moved him off schedule knew his route. That means they have access to his calendar, or to someone who does. Which means the leak is close, Park said. Yes, we know. Behind them, the ambulance bay doors opened, and a paramedic crew came through with an empty gurney. And Lena and Park both shifted position automatically, casually, the way people who have had certain kinds of training shift position in response to movement behind them without appearing to do so. Paramedics went past. The doors closed. I need 24 hours, Lena said. I need to know what's in the file before I can know what they're planning to use it for. You have 12. She looked at him. 3 people already know Webb is here, Park said. By morning, it'll be more. Whatever is in that archive, and whatever someone is planning to do with it, it's already in motion, Lena. You don't have time to wait and see. She stood in the ambulance bay in her scrubs, with her name badge clipped at the collar, the same way she had been standing in the trauma bay 40 minutes ago, when a dying man had found her face across a room and lifted his broken arm into a salute. She had spent 2 years building a version of herself that nobody looked at twice. She had 12 hours before that version stopped being sufficient. Inside the trauma bay, through the walls she couldn't see through, Marcus Webb's arm was getting its blood back. Tissue was alive. The crisis had been averted by exactly the kind of intervention that nobody in that hospital knew she was capable of, and she had done it in exactly the way she had always done things, quietly, without announcement, from the back of the room. That was the problem with the kind of quiet she had built around herself. Only worked until someone who knew the truth walked through the door. And now 3 people who knew the truth were somewhere in Montana, one of them unconscious in her hospital, one of them standing 4 feet away, and one of them still unknown, and the file with her name on it was already out of the archive, and in someone else's hands. She turned back toward the hospital entrance. 12 hours, she said. She pushed through the doors. Her badge caught the light as they swung shut behind her, and for a moment, just a moment, her name was visible on the fluorescent-lit plastic in the cold Montana air. Voigt L. nursing staff. Somewhere in a room she had never visited, someone had a different file with a different designation, beneath a different name, and they were already reading it. The shift change board still had her name on room 7 when Lena came back through the trauma bay doors, and she walked past it without stopping, past the supply cart that someone had left, blocking the hallway again, past the break room where she could hear 2 residents talking about lunch, and she went direct to the workstation at the end of the corridor and pulled up Marcus Webb's chart on the terminal. His arm was responding. The decompression had worked. Solis had documented the procedure in clinical language that was thorough and accurate and made no mention of who had identified the hematoma or why the amputation had been called off. Chart read as though the diagnosis had emerged naturally from the team's assessment process, which was the kind of revision that happened in medicine more often than anyone liked to acknowledge, and which Lena had neither the standing nor the interest to correct. She noted his vitals pressure coming up, oxygen saturation climbing back toward normal, and she noted the medication orders, and she noted that Dr. Farr had written a post-procedure note that also contained no reference to her presence in the room, and then she closed the chart and went to check on Gerald in room 11, because Gerald's potassium was still worth watching, and because standing at a workstation for too long in a corridor where people could see her, thinking was not something she could afford right now. Gerald was asleep. She checked the monitor, adjusted the drip rate by a small amount that the order technically authorized her to adjust without a countersignature, and stood in the dim room for 90 seconds and let herself think. Park had said 12 hours. He had also said the leak was close to Webb, which meant someone with calendar access, which meant either a staff member or a compromised communication channel, and either of those possibilities had implications that she was not going to be able to fully assess without more information. The file that had been pulled from the archive, she needed to know exactly what was in it, generally. Specifically, because the decisions she had made in the field during those 14 months had covered a range of situations, and some of those situations were straightforward, and some of them were not, and whoever had pulled the file would be working with what they had, and what they had would shape what they intended to do with it. She needed to talk to Webb. Webb was currently unconscious and post-procedure, and surrounded by a trauma team that did not know who he was, and visiting him without a documented reason would draw exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid. She went back to the workstation and added a nursing note to Webb's chart, monitoring for post-procedure neurological response, checking in per protocol, which gave her a documented reason to be in the room and would not stand out to anyone reading the chart later. Then she went to room 4 first, because the woman with the warm, hard calf was still there and still waiting, and whatever was happening with the archive file and Park and the 12-hour clock, the woman in room 4 had a potential pulmonary embolism and needed someone to push her workup forward. The resident she had handed the chart to earlier had not yet ordered the Doppler. She found him at the nursing station writing up a different patient and told him, with the same flatness she had used in the trauma bay, that room 4's D-dimer trend, combined with the presentation of the right calf, met clinical criteria for urgent vascular imaging, and that if he had questions about that clinical criteria, she would be happy to walk through it with him. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a first-year resident who had just been made to feel stupid by someone without an MD behind her name. It was an expression she had seen many times, and one she did not have the patience to manage carefully today. "The Doppler," she said, and walked away. She was halfway to Webb's room when Patricia Dunn stepped out from behind the medication cart and positioned herself in the center of the hallway in the specific way that people position themselves when they want you to understand that stopping is not optional. Lena stopped. "I need a word with you," Patricia said. "I've got a monitoring check on the post-procedure in room 9. This will take 2 minutes." Patricia kept her voice low, which was professional, and her face arranged in a neutral expression, which was also professional, but there was something underneath both of those things that was not neutral at all. "What you did in the trauma bay this morning was outside your role and outside your authorization. Dr. Solis may have allowed it in the moment, but that decision is being reviewed. Reviewed by who? By the department. By Dr. Solis himself and Dr. Marlowe. A nurse making a differential diagnosis call and intervening in a surgical procedure is a serious protocol issue, Voight, regardless of outcome." Lena looked at her. "The arm is intact." "That's not the point." "Seems like the point." Patricia's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm trying to give you a heads up before this becomes formal. The appropriate response here is to acknowledge the overstep and agree to work within your defined role going forward. I'm a trauma nurse. You are. And trauma nurses do not countermand surgical directives in the middle of a procedure. I didn't countermand anything. I offered a clinical observation and asked for imaging to confirm it. Dr. Solis made the call. After you inserted yourself into his decision-making process in front of his entire team." Lena held Patricia's gaze and said nothing for a moment, because the thing she wanted to say, which was that the man's arm would be in a surgical waste bin right now if she had stayed in room 7 like she'd been told, was accurate, but would not help anything. "I'll be more careful about how I raise concerns," she said, which was not the acknowledgement of wrongdoing Patricia wanted, but was the most she was willing to offer. Patricia studied her for a beat, as if deciding whether that was sufficient. Then she stepped aside. Lena went to Webb's room. He was awake. That was the first surprise. Post-decompression, post-sedation. With a blood pressure that had only climbed to acceptable levels in the last hour, he should have been at minimum drowsy, and most patients in his condition would be navigating the fuzzy transition between sedation and consciousness with the careful disorientation of someone who didn't know yet what time zone they were in. Webb was looking at the ceiling with the focused, deliberate attention of a man who had already taken inventory of the room, assessed the exits, noted who was in the corridor outside, and was now waiting. He heard her come in and turned his head. "Chief," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, but the cadence was exactly the same. "Don't," she said, and moved to the bedside and checked the monitor. His pressure was up to 104/68, which was better. His arm was elevated on a foam wedge, wrapped in fresh dressings, and there was color in the fingers now, real color, not the gray she had seen on the gurney. "You saved the arm," he said. "Solus saved the arm. Solus was going to cut it off." He paused. "I heard you. In and out, but I heard you." She picked up his chart from the bedside hook and reviewed the medication timing without responding. "Lena." He almost never used her name. The sound of it shifted something in the room. "I wasn't supposed to be on Route 9 this morning." "I know," Park told me. His eyes sharpened slightly. "Park is here. He was an hour ago. He's repositioned." She set the chart back. "He told me about the archive." Webb closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked like a man trying to make a decision about how much to say in how little time. "How much did he tell you?" "Enough. Someone pulled files under my name. Medical records from the classified ops. He said it's already in motion." "It is." He shifted against the pillow, and his face tightened, not from the arm, she thought, but from the effort of what he was about to say. "The person who pulled those files has been sitting on them for a while. We think at least 4 months. They've been selecting what to use and what to hold back. Selecting for what purpose? To build a case. A public case." He looked at her directly. "There's a journalist. Someone fed him a version of your medical records, the procedures you performed during the Kelvin deployment. Bilateral field amputations, the emergency triage decisions, the call you made on Sergeant Daughtry." He paused. "Without the authorization documents, those decisions look like a rogue medic operating without orders." Lena felt the specific coldness of that settle through her. Not panic, something colder and quieter than panic. "The authorization is in the archive. 3 documents are missing from the archive. The 3 that establish you were operating under emergency field protocol with command authorization." His voice was steady, but only because he was making it steady. "Without those 3 documents, every major call you made during Kelvin looks unauthorized. And whoever built this case knew exactly which 3 to take." The monitor beeped a steady rhythm between them. "Daughtry's family," she said. "Daughtry's family has not been contacted. Not yet." Webb's expression shifted into something careful. "But if this goes public the way it's being set up to go public, that changes." She knew what he was not saying. She knew it the way she knew the anatomy of the arm she had just helped save, not from looking it up but from the kind of knowledge that lived in the body. Sergeant Aaron Daughtry had come to her with a wound that was not survivable by any standard available to her at the location and time in question, and the decision she had made in the next 90 seconds was one she had reviewed in her own mind approximately 800 times over the subsequent 2 years and arrived at the same answer every time, which was that it was the correct decision, and it had saved the 3 soldiers behind him in the extraction line. But correct decisions made in the field under emergency protocols, extracted from their context and presented to a public audience without the authorization documents that gave them legal and command sanction, did not look like correct decisions, like something else entirely. "Who?" she said. "Who built this?" Webb shook his head once, and she understood that he was not withholding. He genuinely didn't have a name yet. Someone with access to the archive and enough understanding of military record classification to know what to remove and what to leave. Former contractor, possibly. Someone who understood how the documentation system worked. And the journalist, Daniel Mercer. He's freelance. Legitimate record. Decent reputation, not a tabloid operation. Webb's voice was flat. "He thinks he has a real story, Lena. He's not in on it. Whoever fed him the files did it cleanly enough that he believes what he received is authentic and complete." She pulled the chair from beside the bed and sat in it, because standing for this conversation was suddenly more than she wanted to do. "How long before he publishes?" "We don't know. Days, maybe. A week at the outside." He looked at her. "I came here to warn you in person because I didn't trust that the digital channels were clean, and I was apparently right about that, given that someone knew my route this morning. Calendar leak, yes." He shifted his arm slightly on the foam wedge and didn't hide the pain that crossed his face, which told her he was more exhausted than he was showing. "Park is trying to identify it from his end. But even if we find the leak, it doesn't solve the archive problem. Those 3 documents are still missing, and without them. I know what it looks like without them." They sat with that for a moment. Outside the room, the corridor sounds continued wheels on linoleum. A PA announcement, the distant clatter of a tray. The ordinary machinery of a hospital running its ordinary day indifferent to the conversation happening in room 9. There are backup copies, Webb said finally. There are supposed to be backup copies of every classified archive document in the secondary repository at Fort Erickson. Those backups are intact, are they? I don't know yet. I was trying to get confirmation when the route thing happened. He looked at the ceiling again, briefly, and she recognized the look. It was the look of a man calculating how many variables he couldn't control. There's someone who would know. Former intelligence coordinator, name of Warren Sable. He processed the secondary repository submissions for our unit for 3 years. If the backups were filed correctly, he would have the record. Where is he? Retired. He's in Billings, which is where I was supposed to be today. Webb's mouth did something that was almost dry amusement. Inconveniently. Lena looked at the monitor. His pressure was holding. The arm was stable. He needed rest, and he needed to stay horizontal, and he needed, at minimum, another 24 hours of monitored care before anyone should be thinking about moving him. Stay in this bed, she said. You can't. She stood. Your brachial artery had a hematoma the size of a golf ball on it 4 hours ago. The decompression worked, but the tissue needs time. And if you stand up and try to go to Billings, you are going to compromise the repair and end up back on that surgical table. And this time Solis won't have me standing in the doorway to stop him. She picked up the chart. Find another way to reach Sable. He looked at her with the expression of a commanding officer who has just been told what to do by someone he outranks and is deciding how to respond to that. It was a look she had received from him before, in different circumstances. She held it without flinching. All right, he said, which was not agreement exactly, but was close enough. The door when he spoke again. The people who did this, whoever they are, they know your name, Lena, your real history. They built this entire thing around you specifically. He paused. You should be careful about who you trust in this building. She thought about Patricia Dunn in the hallway. She thought about Farr's laugh in the trauma bay. She thought about Gerald through the wall, who said he hadn't laughed at the impressions. I'm always careful, she said, and went back into the corridor. Spent the next hour doing her job with the disciplined focus of someone who has learned to compartmentalize not as a coping mechanism but as a functional strategy. Room 7's a possible DVT, now confirmed by the Doppler that the resident had finally ordered, with a treatment plan she documented thoroughly and handed off to the attending. Room 11, Gerald awake now, eating a small lunch, asking her with genuine curiosity whether she had always been a nurse. She said yes, which was close enough to true. Room 3, post-procedure patient doing well, vitals stable, documentation clean. She moved through the floor like she always moved through it, efficiently, without fanfare, doing work that the people with the larger titles and the longer credential strings would not think to notice until it wasn't done. And she thought about Warren Sable in Billings. She thought about the secondary repository and what it would mean if the backup copies were there, intact, with correct metadata, and what it would mean if they weren't. At 2 in the afternoon, she took her lunch break, 15 minutes late, and went to the east stairwell, the one that smelled like something had died in the wall, and she stood in it and sent a message through a communications channel that was not her phone and was not logged in any system connected to Hargrove County Medical Center. And she said 3 words and a number. The number's of Sable's name, rendered in a format that Park would recognize. She went back upstairs and ate half a sandwich at the workstation and was writing up Room 7's updated plan when Dr. Raymond Solis appeared at the end of the corridor. He was not in scrubs anymore. He had changed to his white coat, which meant he had been in meetings, and his expression had the particular set of a man who had made a decision and was not entirely comfortable with it. Stopped at the workstation. He did not sit. Voigt, he said. Dr. Solis. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter rather than at her, and she waited because there was nothing useful she could add before she knew what he was going to say. The ultrasound finding was real, he said finally. The hematoma, the compression pattern. I've reviewed the imaging twice. He paused. I would not have caught it in that time frame. Not at that presentation stage. She said nothing. I want to understand how you caught it. He looked up now. Your file says 2 hospital rotations. Standard trauma nursing experience. That diagnosis required a specific understanding of compressive vascular injury that isn't part of a standard nursing curriculum. I've seen a version of it before, she said. Different context. What context? She held his gaze for a beat. Field medicine. Something moved across Solis's face, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. Quiet kind that happens when someone rearranges a set of assumptions about another person in real time. He was a good surgeon, she thought. Good surgeons learn to do that quickly. Field medicine, he repeated. Yes, he considered that. I'm going to document the imaging findings accurately, he said, including the timeline of when the diagnosis was proposed. That's your call. It's the accurate record. He straightened slightly. The review that Dunn mentioned, I've asked for it to be tabled. What you did was outside protocol, and I'll be addressing the protocol piece separately. But I'm not going to file a report that misrepresents what actually happened in that room. She absorbed that carefully, because it mattered more than she could let him see it mattered. Thank you. I'm not doing you a favor. His voice was even. I'm filing an accurate record. That's what I'm supposed to do. He turned to go. Then he stopped. The patient in room 9. Do you know him? She did not look away. Why? Because when he was coming out of sedation, before the nursing staff had his name in the system, he said, your name, not your title, your name. We've crossed paths before, she said. A long time ago. Solis studied her for a moment, and she could see him deciding what to ask next and then deciding not to. It was the decision of a man who had enough experience to understand that some answers he was given would not be the real ones, and that pushing was not always the right surgical instinct. He's stable, Solis said. Good recovery trajectory. Keep an eye on the distal perfusion. He walked away. She let out a breath she had not decided to hold and went back to the chart. 3:45, her non-phone received a response. One line. Park's shorthand clipped and efficient. Sable confirms secondary repository filing. 3 documents. Intact. Dated correctly. Will take time to access. She read it twice. Then she closed the channel and put the device back in her scrub pocket and scanned for comfort with the information, letting it settle. The backup copies existed. The authorization was there somewhere, in a secondary repository at Fort Erickson, in a filing system that would take time and bureaucratic wait to access. That was the good version of this. The bad version was that whoever had built the case against her also had 4 months to prepare for the possibility that someone would look for backups, and 4 months was long enough to build countermeasures. She thought about what Webb had said. They built this entire thing around you, specifically. That word specifically was the part that had been sitting at the back of her mind for the last 2 hours. Not a general attempt to discredit her unit or to expose classified operations broadly. Specifically her. Specifically the Kelvin deployment. Specifically those 3 authorization documents, and no others. Someone had a reason to want her discredited specifically. She was still turning that over when the trauma bay doors came open at the end of the corridor. And she looked up automatically, the way you look up in a trauma unit when doors open, because it usually means something is coming through them. 4 people came through the doors. Not a patient. No gurney. No medical equipment. 4 men in civilian clothes, dark jackets. Nothing identifying who moved through the hospital entrance with the contained, deliberate efficiency of people who had been in a lot of different buildings and always knew where the exits were. They spread slightly as they came through the doors, which was not how a group of friends or colleagues moved through a space. It was how people moved through a space when they were conducting a sweep. The one in front was tall, maybe 40, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that gave nothing away. He stopped at the nursing station and spoke briefly to the unit coordinator, who pointed in the direction of the trauma bay. All 4 of them looked up. They looked at Lena, and then in an action that was wholly unexpected, in the middle of the second-floor trauma ward of Hargrove County Medical Center at 3:46 on a Wednesday afternoon, all 4 of them stood straight and saluted. Not the casual half gesture of someone being informal. Correct salute. Thumb tucked, fingers flat, wrist locked. Kind that meant something specific about who was doing it and who they were doing it to. Patricia Dunn had come to the nursing station to check a chart and was standing 4 feet away with her mouth slightly open. The resident who had finally ordered the Doppler for room 4 had frozen in the middle of the hallway with a patient file under his arm. The unit coordinator was looking between the 4 men and Lena with the expression of someone trying to reconcile 2 things that her training had not prepared her to reconcile. Lena did not salute back. She stood at the workstation with her pen in her hand and her name badge clipped at her collar and waited. The tall one in front came toward her and stopped at a respectful distance, not a threatening distance, not an intimate one. The distance of someone who knew the correct protocol. Nurse Waite, he said. That's my name tag, she agreed. The faintest edge of something moved across his face. Not amusement exactly, recognition maybe. I'm Captain Elias Forte, JAG Corps. We've come from Colonel Webb's unit. He glanced briefly toward the corridor that led to room 9. We're aware the colonel is here and receiving care. We're not here about him. He looked back at her. We're here because of what was taken from the archive. Corridor was very quiet. She was aware of Patricia Dunn standing at the edge of her vision, not moving. She was aware of the resident, still frozen in the hallway. She was aware of Gerald, somewhere through the wall, who had said he didn't laugh. You should have a consultation room, she said. Not here. Forte nodded once. Of course. She led them down the corridor to the small family consultation room near the elevators. 4 chairs, a round table, a window that looked out over the parking structure. She went in last and closed the door. Forte sat. The other 3 stood, which was not hostility, it was habit. 4 months ago, Forte said, a former logistics contractor named Garrett Voss accessed the classified archive for Colonel Webb's unit using credentials that had been suspended 6 months prior. He was in the system for 11 minutes. When the access was flagged and reviewed, 3 documents were missing. He put a folder on the table. Those documents are the authorization records for the Kelvin deployment. Your deployment. I know which deployment. We believe Voss has already transmitted a selected portion of your classified medical file to a journalist named Mercer. We believe Mercer intends to publish. He looked at her steadily. Without the 3 authorization documents, the publication will portray you as having conducted unauthorized battlefield medical procedures. Specifically, the decisions made during the Daughtry incident and the secondary triage events following it. The backups at Fort Erickson, she said. Forte's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. You know about the secondary repository. I know the backups should be there. I know accessing them takes time. I know 4 months is long enough for someone who built this carefully to have planned for someone finding them. She looked at him. Has Voss done anything to the backups? Forte was quiet for a beat, which was its own answer. Tell me, she said. The backup copies exist, Forte said carefully. They are intact and correctly dated. However, he paused, and she could see him choosing the words with precision. Voss also created a set of fabricated documents. High quality, correct format, correct classification markings, designed to match the original documents in every visible parameter. He looked at her. The fabrications are dated earlier than the originals. She understood immediately. He poisoned the well, she said. If someone finds the real backups and presents them as evidence, he has a matching set of fabrications that he can claim are the originals. The metadata on his versions is earlier, so they look like the source documents. She looked at the folder on the table. He's not trying to hide the authorization. He's trying to make the authentic authorization look like the fake one. Yes, Forte said. That she stopped. She had been about to say sophisticated, and it was, but what it actually was, sitting in front of her, was a trap with a counterweight. Kind of trap that gets more dangerous the harder you try to get out of it. We have a digital forensics team working on the metadata analysis, Forte said. Possible likely, even that we can establish which documents are original and which are fabricated. But it takes time, and it requires the right chain of custody to be usable in any official proceeding. He leaned forward slightly. If Mercer publishes before we have that chain is established, then even the correct version of events looks like a cover-up, she said. You present the real authorization documents after a public accusation has already landed, and it looks like someone manufactured them to protect me. Exactly. She leaned back in the chair. The window showed the parking structure in flat afternoon light. Car pulled in slowly, found a space, sat still. An ordinary thing in an ordinary day, completely indifferent to the room. How much time, she said. For the metadata analysis? For all of it. The chain of custody, the forensics, the access request for the secondary repository. Fort spread his hand slightly. A week. Possibly less. Mercer might not give you a week. No. She looked at the folder on the table. What's in that? What we know about Voss, his access logs, his contractor history, the pattern of how he built this. Pulled it toward her and opened it. The first page was a photograph. Mid-50s, heavy build, the kind of face that looked like it had spent years being patient in rooms where important people were talking. Contractor badge visible on his lapel, a company she didn't recognize, which meant nothing because she hadn't been tracking the contractor landscape for 2 years. She read the access log. 11 minutes in the archive. 11 minutes was not enough time to read everything. It was enough time for someone who already knew exactly what he was looking for and exactly where it was filed. He knew our filing system, she said. He worked in logistics for the unit for 2 years. He would have had exposure to. No, I mean he knew our specific filing system. The internal one. The way we cross-reference by deployment rather than by name. She pointed to the access log. He went directly to the Kelvin subsection. No search queries, no browsing. He went straight there in under 2 minutes. She looked up. Someone briefed him. Someone who knew the archive structure from the inside told him exactly where to look. Forte's jaw set slightly. He had clearly already considered this. We're looking at that. Look harder. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, not offense at the instruction, but the kind of response that happens when someone says a thing out loud that you have been trying not to think too directly. Yes, he said. She closed the folder. Outside the consultation room, the hospital continued its ordinary afternoon. Someone's visitor walked past the window in the door, trailing a Mylar balloon. A gurney went by, empty wheels squeaking in the specific rhythm that specific wheels make on linoleum. Garrett Voss had spent 4 months building something that was designed not just to destroy her reputation, but to make the truth look like a lie. He had used her file, her decisions, her deployments, the specific and particular record of things she had actually done in specific and particular circumstances, and he had constructed a framework around it that turned each fact into a different shape. The most dangerous kind of trap, she knew from experience, was the kind that used real materials. Stood up. I want full copies of the access logs and the metadata comparison when your forensics team has preliminary results, she said. Not summaries. Raw data. Forte looked at her for a moment. You're not military anymore. I know what I am. She picked up the folder. Do you want help or don't you? Another pause. Then, from one of the 3 men who had been standing silently against the wall, the one on the left, who had a slight build, and the careful eyes of someone who processed information rather than force a small, quiet exhale that was as close to amusement as the room was going to produce. Forte's mouth pressed flat. Then he nodded once. We'll send the data tonight, he said. She handed the folder back and went to the door and put her hand on the handle and stopped, because through the small window in the consultation room door, she could see the corridor. And in the corridor, standing at the nursing station with his back to her, talking to Patricia Dunn with the relaxed posture of someone who had been there before and was comfortable, was a man she had never seen. He was maybe 45, medium height, wearing a press lanyard over a gray jacket. He was writing something in a notebook while Patricia talked, which was not a notepad the way doctors used notepads, and not a chart the way nurses used charts. It was a reporter's notebook. She could tell from 20 feet away. She had seen them before. Patricia was talking. The man was writing. And Patricia, who had spent the morning telling Lena to stay in her lane and work within her defined role, was leaning across the nursing station counter with the body language of someone who was finding the conversations very interesting and who had quite a lot to contribute to it. Lena stood at the consultation room door with her hand on the handle and watched through the small window and felt something settle into place in her chest. Not anger, not exactly, but something colder and more useful than anger. The specific focus that comes from understanding a situation more clearly than you understood it 30 seconds ago. She didn't know yet what Patricia knew. She didn't know yet what the man with the notebook had already written down, or what he had been told, or whether what he had been told was the kind of thing that would be in tomorrow's draft, or next week's published story. What she knew was that somewhere in this hospital, in room 9, Marcus Webb was lying in a hospital bed with a titanium plate in his left tibia and an arm that was only there because she had stepped forward when she wasn't supposed to. What she knew was that Garrett Voss had spent 4 months building a lie out of true materials, and that the lie had a journalist attached to it, and that the journalist was currently standing at the nursing station of the floor where she worked, talking to the charge nurse who had already told her twice today that she didn't belong. And what she knew, with the flat, practiced certainty of someone who had made irreversible decisions in bad conditions before, was that the next 12 hours had just gotten significantly shorter. She did not go back to the nursing station. She stood at the consultation room door for another 4 seconds, long enough to confirm what she was seeing, and to make a decision about how to respond to it, and then she turned back to the room and looked at Forte. The man at the nursing station, she said. Gray jacket, press lanyard. Is that Mercer? Forte came to the door and looked through the window. Expression did not change, but something in his posture did a slight involuntary shift that told her yes before he said it. It's him, Forte said. He's talking to my charge nurse. I see that. How long has he been in this building? Forte looked at the man on the left, the one with the careful eyes who pulled out a phone and checked something, said, Our surveillance had him entering the parking structure at 14:22. That was over an hour ago. She had been in room 11 with Gerald. She had been in room 7 updating the DVT plan. She had been doing her job in the ordinary way, while a journalist with a notebook and a curated set of classified documents had been working his way toward the people most likely to talk to him on the second floor of this hospital. He didn't come here by accident, she said. No, Forte agreed. Someone told him Webb was here, which means the calendar leak and the journalist are connected. Or the person who told Mercer about Webb is the same person who moved Webb off his billing schedule this morning. She looked at Forte, or both. Forte's jaw worked slightly. We're not certain yet. I am. She looked through the window again. Patricia had her arms crossed now, the body language of someone who has been talking long enough to feel invested in the conversation. Dunn doesn't know anything classified. She doesn't know who Webb is or what's in my file, but she knows I intervened in the trauma bay this morning. She knows the colonel recognized me, and she knows enough about what happened to make today look like a story. Lena paused. That might be all Mercer needs to decide his source material is confirmed. What do you want to do? She thought about the options available to her in the next 3 minutes. She could go out to the nursing station, which would make her visible to Mercer and potentially confirm his interest. She could wait in the consultation room until he left, which gave Patricia more time to tell him whatever she was going to tell him. She could ask Forte's team to intervene, which would look like exactly what it was, military involvement in a civilian hospital, on the day a journalist was asking questions, and which would be in Mercer's notebook before he reached the elevator. Nothing, she said. We do nothing. Right now. She stepped back from the window. If I walk out there, he has a face and a name. If your team walks out there, he has a story. Let Dunn finish. Let him leave. She looked at Forte. Then I need to know everything in that access log tonight. Not a summary. Everything. Forte held her gaze for a moment that was slightly too long to be comfortable, and then nodded. She waited until Mercer had closed his notebook and shaken Patricia's hand and walked toward the elevator. And then she waited another 90 seconds after the elevator doors closed, and then she went back out to the floor and picked up her workstation terminal and finished documenting Room 7's updated plan, as though the last hour had been a completely ordinary hour, because the discipline of appearing ordinary in extraordinary circumstances was one of the things those 14 months had built into her at a level below decision-making. Patricia came to the station. Who were those men? She said. Not aggressively more, with the particular brand of confused authority that comes from being in charge of a floor and having something happen on it that you don't understand. Consultants, Lena said, without looking up from the terminal. They saluted you, I noticed. Voight. Patricia's voice had something different in it now, not hostility, but a texture that was adjacent to unease. Who are you? Lena saved the documentation and looked up. I'm the nurse on rooms 379 and 11. Same as this morning. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the corridor where the 4 men had been and looked back. The man I spoke with earlier, the journalist he was asking, about the patient in room 9. What did you tell him? That I couldn't confirm patient identity. A pause. And that a staff nurse had intervened in a surgical procedure this morning. Lena kept her expression level. That's all. I wasn't trying to. Patricia stopped, and the unease in her voice settled into something that was closer to doubt. He said he was investigating military medical malpractice. He said, the patient in room 9 might be connected to a larger story. What name did he give you for the patient? Patricia hesitated. He didn't. He showed me a photograph of Webb. I didn't confirm the name. I said I couldn't, but you recognized the photograph. Another hesitation, which was its own confirmation. Lena looked at her steadily. Patricia, I need you to think carefully about whether you're going to talk to that man again. Not because I'm asking you to cover anything, because what he told you about what he's investigating, it's not accurate. And what he's going to publish, if he publishes, is going to hurt someone who doesn't deserve it. Patricia's mouth opened and then closed. She was a competent charge nurse and a difficult woman, and she had been in this hospital for 11 years and none of that experience had prepared her for this particular hallway conversation. "Is it you?" Patricia said finally. "Is it your name in his story?" Lena didn't answer, which was an answer. Patricia looked at her badge. She looked at the corridor. She looked back. "I won't talk to him again," she said, and the declaration was slightly rough around the edges in the way that declarations are when they cost something. "Thank you," Lena said. She meant it. Patricia would never know how much she meant it. The rest of the afternoon shift passed in the ordinary time signature of a trauma floor, fast in some stretches, stalled in others, punctuated by the kind of small crises that resolved with correct intervention and the kind that didn't resolve cleanly, no matter what anyone did. She pushed through it with her hands and her training, and the practiced efficiency that Gerald had noticed, and Patricia had misread as coldness. And at the end of it, she handed off her rooms to the evening crew and gathered her jacket and her bag and took the east stairwell down to the parking level. Park was in the stairwell on the third floor. She didn't break stride. He fell in beside her. "Mercer was in the building," she said. "I know. We had eyes on him. He talked to Dunn. We know what she told him. It's manageable." He held the fire door at the second landing. "What I have for you is less manageable." She stopped on the landing. "The metadata analysis came back preliminary," Park said. "Your team was right that Voss fabricated the counter documents. There's a problem with the forensics." He looked at her directly. "Fabrications aren't just earlier dated. He used the same file generation system, the actual classified document processing software, to create them, which means the metadata profile is identical to a real document at the machine level. The only thing that distinguishes the real authorization documents from Voss's fakes is a 4-character internal code embedded in the original processing batch." He paused. "That code exists in the Fort Erickson secondary repository record. Access that repository and retrieve a document copy with the batch code visible requires a formal records request through the JAG office, which requires command authorization, which requires time," she said. "At minimum 5 to 7 business days for a standard request. There's an expedited pathway, but it requires the requesting officer to have standing in the relevant classified designation. And the only officer currently available who has that standing is Webb," she said. "Webb," Park confirmed, "who is in a hospital bed and whose medical status as of the last check does not support the kind of activity that signing off on a classified expedited records request requires." She leaned against the stairwell wall. The concrete was cold through her jacket. Above them, the fire door to the third floor opened and closed, as someone came through and went up, footsteps receding. "How long does Webb actually need?" she said. Solis said minimum 24 hours before he'd consider any significant activity. Realistically 48. And Mercer. "We don't know his publication timeline. His last story went live 4 days after his source contact. That was a different kind of story." Park's voice was careful. "A military medical misconduct piece with classified documents. He's going to want confirmation. Going to want a second source. Which means he's working his contacts right now. Who else would he call? Anyone who knew you during Kelvin. Anyone who was in the unit." Park hesitated, which was unusual. He was not a man who hesitated. "Lena." Voss approached at least 2 former unit members before he went to the archive. Spent 3 months building relationships with people who served with you. He didn't do that to verify his story. He did it to manufacture additional sources. She looked at him. He built witnesses. He built people who have a version of events that matches his fabricated documents. Whether they believe it or were manipulated into believing it, they'll confirm the same picture. He paused. 2 of them will talk to Mercer. We're reasonably certain. She absorbed that, stood with it, let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as she could afford to feel it, which was approximately 8 seconds. Then she pushed off the wall. "The batch code," she said. "It's in the repository record. Who else has standing to access that designation? It's narrow. Webb's CO, who is currently at a command post in Germany. The unit's original JAG officer who retired 2 years ago." Park looked at her. "And the senior medical officer of record for the Kelvin deployment." She waited. "Which is you," Park said. "You were never formally removed from that designation because the unit was classified and the transition documentation was never processed through the civilian system." She blinked once. "I can sign the records request." "Technically, yes." He pulled a folded paper from his inside pocket. "Forte drafted it. It's been sitting with him for 3 hours because he wasn't sure you'd want to re-engage that designation." "Paper." She unfolded it. It was a formal expedited records request for the Fort Erickson Secondary Repository, correctly formatted, with her original military designation, printed in the header Chief Warrant Officer Lena Voigt, 18DS, Medical Officer of Record, Kelvin Deployment, and a signature line at the bottom. Her hands were steady. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. "Tell Forte I'll return it tonight," she said. She went home. Her apartment was a fourth-floor unit in a building that was functional and not much more gray carpet, windows that faced the parking lot, a kitchen where she had learned to cook 4 dishes that she rotated through without much variation. She had lived in it for 6 weeks, and it looked like 6 weeks. Coffee maker on the counter, scrubs drying over the shower rod, stack of medical reference materials on the small desk that the building called a study nook, and which was really just a corner with a surface. She sat at the desk and opened her personal laptop, the civilian one, not the secure channel, and she searched Daniel Mercer. He had a professional website and a publications history that went back 11 years. He was based out of Denver. His work was solid investigative pieces for national outlets, 2 awards, a reputation that was built on getting documents and verifying them before he published. He was not a sensationalist. He was the kind of journalist who was dangerous, precisely because he was careful. She read his last 3 major pieces. They were well constructed and fair. Even the one that had gotten a government official removed from a federal contracting position was not unfair. It was simply accurate, and the official had done what the documents said he had done. Mercer had confirmed sources, checked records, given subjects the opportunity to respond before publication, which meant that if Voss's package had come to Mercer looking complete documents, timestamps, former unit members willing to confirm a narrative, Mercer would have no reason to doubt it. He would do his due diligence, and his due diligence would return the same picture that Voss had built, because Voss had built it to survive due diligence. Unless. She pulled up a contact screen on the secure channel and typed a message. "Need direct contact for Mercer. Tonight. Not through intermediary. My initiative, my exposure." She sent it and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the counter while it brewed and did not look at her phone. The response came in 4 minutes. "Park. That's a significant risk. Publishes before we have the repository documents. Direct contact from you becomes part of the story." She typed, "I know. Send it." A pause. Then a phone number. She looked at it for a moment. She poured the coffee. She drank half of it standing at the counter, and then she picked up her phone, her actual phone, the civilian one that could be traced and logged and dialed. It rang 3 times. Mercer. His voice was even not guarded. A man who answered unknown numbers, because that was part of the work. "This is Lena Voigt," she said. "I understand you've been asking questions about me." A silence. Not a long one, maybe 2 seconds, but the kind of silence that has thought in it. "Ms. Voigt. Or is it? Voigt is fine. I wasn't sure you'd call." "I'm calling." She sat down at the desk. "I want to know what you have. I don't think that's how this usually... I know how it usually works. I'm asking you to tell me what you think you have, because I think what you have is incomplete. And I think when you publish it, it will be wrong. And I think you're a careful enough journalist to want to know that before you publish it." She kept her voice even. "I'm not asking you to kill the story. I'm asking for a conversation." Another pause. Longer. "What makes you think it's incomplete?" he said. "Because 3 documents are missing from what you were given. Specifically 3. And the person who gave them to you removed those 3 deliberately, because they're the documents that change what everything else means." Mercer was quiet. "You have a story," she said. "But you have a story that someone built for you to find. I want to show you what the actual story is." She could hear him thinking. She could hear it in the quality of the silence, not reluctance, but the careful calibration of a man who was revising his assessment in real time. "I'd want to meet in person," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Before 9. "I can do 8, he said. "There's a diner on Callaway Street. Text you the address." "Fine." She picked up her coffee. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at more information before you decide what the truth is. That's all. That's all," he repeated. And there was something in his voice, not quite warmth, but the sound of a person who has just recalibrated slightly. "Okay, Ms. Voigt." 8 o'clock. She hung up. She spent the next 3 hours at the desk with the access log Forte had sent to the secure channel, going through it line by line. 11 minutes in the classified archive. She read the timestamp sequence 3 times until she could see the shape of what Voss had done Not just the documents he had taken, but the pattern of his navigation through the system. He had moved through the archive like someone reading a map he had memorized in advance. No wrong turns, no backtracking. He had gone into the Kelvin subsection, accessed the authorization subdirectory, removed 3 specific files, and exited. Confidence of the navigation told her something specific. He had done a dry run. Not in the archive itself, the access log would have shown it, but somewhere. He had practiced the file path. He had known the subdirectory structure well enough to move through it in under 2 minutes without searching. That meant a source inside the archive system, not just someone who had told him about the files, someone who had given him the exact path. File tree of a classified archive was not public knowledge. You couldn't infer it from the outside. You had to have been inside it or have access to someone who had. She wrote down 3 names from the unit's administrative history, people who had processed documents into the Kelvin archive who were not currently on active duty. She sent them to Park with 2 words, cross-reference Voss. At 11:30, Park responded. 1 match. Administrative contractor, 2019-2021. Name is Deirdre Falk, currently employed by Voss's logistics consulting firm. There it was. She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and felt the specific satisfaction of a mechanism, becoming visible, not pleasure, exactly, but the relief of understanding a system that had been designed to be opaque. Falk had given Voss the map. Voss had used the map to take the right documents and leave the right shadow. And then he had spent 4 months building a second map out of fabricated materials, designed to make the original look false. It was careful work. It was genuinely skilled work, in the way that certain kinds of destructive capability require skill to execute. She forwarded everything to Forte with a note. Falk is the archive source. Sapoina, her communications with Voss. If she transmitted the file path, it will be in her outgoing data from 2022. Then she signed the expedited records request, photographed it, sent it through the secure channel, and went to bed. She did not sleep well, which she had not expected to. She slept in the fractured, alert way she had learned to sleep in places where sleeping deeply was inadvisable surface level, aware of sound, not quite absent. She had thought she was past that. She had thought 2 years of Room 7 and Room 11 had softened that particular edge. Apparently not. She was at the diner on Calloway Street at 7:52. Mercer was already there. He was a slightly built man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the permanent mild alertness of someone who processed his environment continuously. He was drinking black coffee and had a closed notebook on the table in front of him, which she read as a deliberate choice he had come to listen first. She sat across from him. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," he said. "I look like a trauma nurse who worked a full shift yesterday." It's the same thing. She picked up the menu, looked at it for 4 seconds, and put it down. "I want to start with a question. All right. The documents you received, were they delivered digitally or physically?" Studied her. "Digitally. Encrypted transfer. Were you able to verify the encryption source?" "It was routed through a secure channel." My contact assured. "Your contact is Garrett Voss," she said. His expression did not change in the way that expressions change when someone is surprised. Changed in the way that expressions change when someone hears something they already half knew and has been waiting to have confirmed. That was a meaningful distinction. "I can't confirm source identities," he said. "You don't have to. I'm telling you his name because I already know he contacted you, and I want to be honest about what I know. So you know I'm not guessing at the edges of this." She set her phone on the table. On the screen was the access log from the classified archive, with Voss's credential string at the top and the 11-minute timestamp. This is the archive access record from the system, where your documents originated. The person who accessed that archive did so with suspended credentials, took 11 minutes, and removed 3 documents, specifically the 3 that would establish that every medical decision I made during the deployment your documents describe was authorized under emergency field protocol. Mercer picked up the phone. He looked at the log carefully. He was not pretending to read it, he was reading it. "The documents I was given," he said slowly, "included what appeared to be a complete archive pull. They included what appeared to be a complete pull. That's different from a complete pull." She took the phone back. 3 missing documents are in the secondary repository at Fort Erickson. We have a records request in process. The batch code in the repository will match the originals and distinguish them from the fabricated versions Voss created as a countermeasure. Mercer set down his coffee cup. He created fabrications, specifically designed to make the real authorization look manufactured after the fact. His versions are earlier dated. He used the same document processing software as the actual archive to make the metadata identical at the machine level. She paused. The only distinguishing marker is the batch code in the original processing record. He was quiet for a moment. He took off his glasses from his forehead and turned them in his hands in the way of someone who needed something to do with his hands while he thought. The former unit members who confirmed elements of your source material, she said. At least 2 of them were cultivated by Voss over several months. He gave them a version of events that matched his fabricated documents before he brought you in. They believe what they told you. That's not the same as it being true. How do you know about the... Because I know how he built this. Can see the structure. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Mercer, I know what your story looks like from the documents you have. I was a combat medic who made unauthorized decisions in the field that cost a soldier his life. I know that's the story. And I know that if you publish it with the sources and documents you currently have, it will look accurate. She held his gaze. I'm asking you to give us time to retrieve the repository documents. That's all. I'm not asking you to kill it. If the repository documents don't change what you have, you publish exactly what you were going to publish. He was still turning his glasses. How long, he said. 5 to 7 days for the standard pathway. We have an expedited request in. Possibly faster. Possibly, he repeated. I signed it myself last night, she said. Expedited request requires the medical officer of record for the deployment. Me. I put my name on it, which means I'm attached to the outcome regardless of what the repository shows. She paused. If it showed what Voss built it to look like, I would not have signed it. Mercer put his glasses back on his forehead. He picked up his coffee. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a man revising a complex document in real time, not discarding it, but editing it, rearranging the weight of what he thought he knew. I'll hold for 5 days, he said, not 7. 5. It's enough. If the repository documents don't arrive in 5 days, then you publish what you have. She picked up her phone. I know. She was standing to leave when he said, Ms. Voigt, the soldier. The one in your documents. The decision you made. He wasn't prying, his voice was careful. The voice of someone who understood that some questions deserved to be asked precisely. The right call. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. And I've looked at it from every angle available to me for 2 years. And the answer is still yes. Mercer nodded once slowly. She left the diner and walked to her car in the thin morning light and sat in the driver's seat and called Park. Mercer will hold 5 days, she said. That might be enough. Forte is pushing the expedited pathway. Tell him to push harder. She started the engine. I want the batch code confirmed before. Lena, Park's voice had changed. Something had shifted in it, not alarm, but the particular flatness that his voice developed when he was delivering information he had been carrying for a few minutes and had been deciding how to say. We got Falk's communication records, the ones between her and Voss from 2022. And she transmitted the file path, like you said. But there's more in the communications. A pause. Voss didn't build this alone. Falk's records show a third party. Someone who was coordinating the timeline. Someone who told Voss specifically when to access the archive, when to approach Mercer, and when to move Webb off his billing schedule. She went very still in the driver's seat. Do we have a name, she said. We have a partial. Falk referred to them by a position, not a name. Park's voice was steady and quiet and very careful. Called them the coordinator. And the position she used for the coordinator. He stopped for half a second. The position she described is someone currently inside Hargrove County Medical Center. Parking lot of the diner was ordinary. In the early morning, 2 pickup trucks, a sedan, the diner's sign clicking in the wind. An ordinary Wednesday in Dunmore, Montana. A place she had chosen specifically for its distance from the world that was currently closing around her. Inside the hospital, she said. Yes, who? We don't have a name yet. We have a description from Falk's language, someone with access to patient scheduling, staff assignments, and incoming transfer information. He paused. Someone who knew Webb's patient intake before it was publicly documented. The description settled through her with the cold clarity of a diagnosis arriving too late to change the immediate management plan. Patient scheduling, staff assignments, incoming transfers. The intake board, the assignment clipboard, the yellow tag on room 4 that had been there since the night crew. She thought about who sat at the center of all of that information on the second floor of Hargrove County Medical Center on any given shift. And then her phone buzzed. Not the civilian one she was holding. The secure channel device in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out with her other hand. The message was from Forte, and it was 3 words long, and it was not the message she had been waiting for. Webb is missing. She was already pulling out of the parking lot when she called Forte back. Picked up on the first ring, which told her he had been holding the phone. "What happened?" she said. Night nursing staff did a check at 0600. He was in the bed. Next check at 0645, the bed was empty. Forte's voice had the compressed quality of a man managing a situation that had gone outside his prepared parameters. No discharge paperwork. No nursing notification. His IV line was disconnected at the port, not pulled. Disconnected deliberately. Whoever helped him leave knew what they were doing. He left on his own. We believe so. We think he was ambulatory enough and made the decision without telling anyone. A pause. Personal effects are gone. His phone is gone. We have no signal on the device we gave him. She turned onto the main road and pushed the speed to the upper edge of what was defensible. He heard something. Between last night and this morning, someone told him something that made him decide he couldn't stay in that bed. That's our read too, who had access to his room between 2200 and 0600. Night nursing staff, the overnight resident, and one visitor who signed in at 23:15 and out at 23:52. Forte's voice tightened slightly. The visitor signed in as a family member. The name on the log doesn't match any known contact in Webb's file. Description: male, medium build, dark coat. The desk attendant says he had a visitor badge and seemed calm. That's all she has. Lena ran the math. Webb had woken up at some point after 11 p.m. to a visitor who wasn't family, had a conversation that lasted 37 minutes, and by 6:45 had disconnected his own IV and walked out of a hospital where he had a post-decompression arm repair that was less than 20 hours old. That arm was going to hurt in a way that would make a lesser person reconsider. Webb was not a lesser person, but he was also not invulnerable. And a brachial artery decompression site that got stressed in the wrong way in the next 48 hours could reopen and bleed in ways that were genuinely dangerous without surgical backup. "He's going to Billings," she said. "We think so too. We have people moving in that direction. Warren Sable." Why he went. Whoever visited him last night told him something about Sable or about the repository that made him think he needed to get there personally. She merged onto the highway, and the mountains opened up on both sides of the road in the gray morning light, broad and indifferent. Or they told him something about me. Forte was quiet for a beat. "We're not ruling that out." The coordinator, the person inside the hospital. "What do we have?" Falk's communications reference the coordinator approximately 14 times over 8 months. She uses position language, never a name. But 3 of the references describe specific information that the coordinator provided. He was reading from something. Patient intake scheduling for a colonel-level transfer, staff assignment rotation for the trauma floor, and 1 reference to a direct observation of the subject in a clinical setting. She felt the phrase land. Direct observation of the subject. That was her. Someone in her hospital had been watching her and reporting to Voss's network for long enough to be referenced 14 times in an 8-month communication chain. "Forte," she said. "Pull the visitor log for room 9 for the last 48 hours and cross-reference against the hospital staff directory. Coordinator has to have had a way to get information about Webb's intake quickly within hours of his arrival. That's not someone calling in a favor. That's someone with daily access to incoming patient data. We're on it. And get someone to Sable before Webb does. Not to stop Webb, to make sure Sable is protected. If Voss's people know Webb is moving." "Already done," Forte said. "We had 2 people with Sable since last night." She let out a breath. "Okay." "Lena." He used her first name carefully, the way people use first names when they want the weight of what they're saying to land differently. If Webb gets to Sable and Sable confirms the batch code verbally, it still doesn't give us the legal documentation we need. Webb's presence in Billings doesn't accelerate the records request. It just means he's ambulatory, with a compromised arm in a city 2 hours away. I know. The expedited request is in process. Forte's team is pushing it through the JAG pipeline. 5 days you negotiated with Mercer. I know, she said again. She drove. The highway between Dunmore and Billings was 2 lanes through mountain corridor for the first 40 miles and then opened up into the broader basin of central Montana, wide sky, long sight lines, kind of landscape that made everything feel both very clear and very exposed. She had not told Park she was going to Billings. She had not told Forte. She had hung up the call when the conversation reached its natural end and then continued driving north because Webb had a 24-hour head start in terms of motivation and no head start in terms of physical condition, and because she was the only person in this situation who could sign something that mattered and who also just understood what Webb wanted to do when he got to Sable and what could go wrong when he got there. Her phone rang 40 minutes outside Dunmore. Park put it on speaker. "You're on the highway," he said. Not a question he had some way of knowing, which she didn't ask about. "Yes." Forte's going to be annoyed. Forte can manage. She passed a logging truck and settled back into the right lane. "What do you have?" Cross-reference came back on the visitor log. A pause that was slightly too long. The name on the visitor log for last night's 11 p.m. visit is a fabrication. It doesn't correspond to anyone real. The badge number does exist. It's a reissued badge from the hospital's visitor management system. Reissued 3 weeks ago, after a reported loss. He stopped. The original badge belonged to a staff member who reported it missing. Who? The badge was originally issued to the hospital's patient intake coordinator. His voice was even. A woman named Sandra Pell. She's worked the intake desk on the trauma floor for 6 years. She processes all incoming transfers, assigns rooms, manages the intake board, patient scheduling, staff assignments, incoming transfers, the intake board. The person who had been standing 4 feet from Lena every day for 6 weeks, processing the information that flowed through the trauma floor. The person whose desk sat at the intersection of every piece of patient movement data in the building. The person who had known about Webb's arrival before the nursing staff had his name in the system. Pell, Lena said. Her communications are being pulled now. We'll know within the hour what she transmitted and to whom. But Lena Park hesitated again. Her badge. The one that was supposedly lost. The one that got reissued. We pulled the access logs for that badge number in the last 3 weeks. Tell me. It was used to access the hospital's internal records terminal 4 times after hours. Twice in the last week. He paused. The last access was at 22:47 last night. 40 minutes before the visitor, with the fabricated name, signed into room 9. She held the steering wheel and looked at the road. Someone had used Pell's original badge, or Pell herself had used it to access patient records after hours. And then 40 minutes later, a visitor appeared in Webb's room with information that made a post-surgical colonel disconnect his own IV and walk out of a hospital. The sequence was not subtle once you could see it, but you had to be able to see it, which required having Falk's communication records and the badge access logs and the visitor log all in the same frame at the same time. Voss had built this to be invisible from any single vantage point. Pell at the hospital right now, she said. She clocked in at 7, Park said. She's at her desk. Don't move on her yet, Lena. If you move on her now, you have a badge access log and a communication pull that takes days to process. If you wait, she thought about it fast, the way she thought about things in clinical situations, where the decision tree had to be run in real time. Webb is going to Sable. Whoever visited him last night told him something that made him go. That visitor was connected to Pell, and Pell is connected to Voss, then Voss knows Webb is moving. Which means he's going to try to get to Sable before Webb does. We have people with Sable, which Voss doesn't know. She changed lanes. Let him try. If Voss or someone in his network makes a move on Sable, you catch them in the act, and you have a physical chain of evidence that doesn't depend on metadata or batch codes. She paused. And you get Pell on something harder than an access log. Park was quiet. It's a risk, he said finally. Everything in the last 24 hours has been a risk. This one has an upside. She heard him exhale not agreement, not resistance. The sound of a man who had worked with her long enough to know that when she laid out a sequence of events this cleanly, she had usually already run the failure modes. I'll hold, he said. 1 hour. Then I'm pulling Forte in regardless. 1 hour is enough, she said, and hoped she was right. Warren Sable lived in a quiet neighborhood in the northwestern part of Billings, in a house that had a covered porch and a birch tree in the front yard that was just beginning to turn in the September air. 2 people Forte had placed with him were not visible from the street, which was correct. She parked 2 blocks away and walked. Webb's rental, a different rental, than the one he had arrived in Montana in, which meant he had made at least one logistics call. On his way out of Dunmore was at the curb in front of Sable's house. He had made it. 2 hours of highway driving, post-brachial decompression, running on whatever the hospital had last given him for pain management, and the particular stubbornness of people who had spent careers overriding their bodies' reasonable objections. She went up the porch steps and knocked. Sable opened the door. He was in his late 60s, thin-framed, with the cool eyes of someone who had spent a career managing classified information and had developed a specific kind of patience as a result. He looked at her for a moment. "Chief Warrant Officer Voigt," he said, and then caught himself. "Sorry, Lena." "It's all right," she said. "Is he inside?" "Sitting down," which I had to argue for. He stepped back to let her in. His arm looks like it should be in a hospital. It should be. Webb was in an armchair in Sable's living room. He was upright, which was more than she had expected, and his color was acceptable. And his arm was in an improvised sling, made from what appeared to be a dish towel and a bungee cord, which was creative, and almost certainly not what Solis had had in mind. He looked at her when she came through the door, and his expression shifted from the controlled focus he'd been holding to something that was very briefly, very quietly, something else. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Your sling is a dish towel. Clean dish towel." She crossed the room and looked at his arm without touching it, checking the color of the fingers, the visible swelling at the forearm, the way the improvised pressure sat against the decompression site. It was not good, but it was not immediately catastrophic. He would need imaging when this was over, and he would need Solis to sign off on the repair, and he was almost certainly going to hear a version of what she had said to him yesterday about staying in the bed, delivered with considerably less patience. "Tell me what the visitor told you last night," she said. Webb glanced at Sable. Sable had moved to the kitchen doorway in the specific way that people who have spent careers managing sensitive information move when they're giving people privacy while remaining available. "He told me Voss was planning to move on Sable," Webb said. "Directly. Not through Mercer. He said Voss has someone in his network who was going to approach Sable with a document, a fabricated statement attributed to Sable, claiming he had never processed the authorization documents into the secondary repository." He paused. "That fabricated statement exists and gets submitted alongside Voss's counter documents. Then even the real backup copies get called into question," she finished. "Because the person who supposedly filed them is on record saying he didn't." "Yes, who was the visitor?" Webb's jaw set slightly. "Someone from the unit. Someone I trust." He looked at her. "I'm not giving you the name. He came to warn me, not to be processed into your team's operation." She let that go because there wasn't time to argue it, and because she understood the loyalty it represented, even if it had created a logistical mess. "Does Voss know about the fabricated Sable statement? Does he know it's been compromised?" "Not yet. The visitor only found out last night." Sable, in the kitchen doorway. "Warren, fabricated statement. Has anyone approached you yet?" "No," Sable said, "not yet." She thought about the 1-hour window she had given Park. She thought about Voss, knowing that Webb had left the hospital, knowing that Webb knew about the Sable threat, knowing that the clock on Mercer's hold was running. "Forte's people outside," she said to Webb. "They're protection, but they're also visible. If Voss's contact comes to approach Sable and sees military-adjacent security, they won't come," Webb said. "And we lose the chance to catch them." "Yes." They looked at each other. "You want to pull Forte's people back," Webb said. "Not all the way. Enough to make the approach look viable." She looked at Sable again. "Warren, if someone comes to your door with a document and asks you to sign it a statement about the repository files, what would you do?" Sable was quiet for a moment. "I'd ask to read it carefully." "And while you were reading it carefully, how long would that take?" He understood. "As long as it needed to," he said. She called Park. "I need Forte's people repositioned," she said. "Not gone, repositioned. Out of visible range of the front approach, but within response distance." She gave him the address. "And I need you to have someone watching the street. Anyone who approaches the house in the next 3 hours, I want them photographed and identified." "Play," Park said. It was not a question. "This is the play. 1 hour is up in 20 minutes. I know. Tell Forte." She hung up. She looked at Webb. "You should eat something." "Sable, does he have anything?" "I offered him eggs," Sable said. He said no. "He'll have eggs," she said. Webb started to object. She looked at him with the expression she had deployed in the trauma bay, the one that had no uncertainty in it and he closed his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at Sable and said, eggs would be fine. The next 90 minutes were the specific kind of tense that does not look tense from the outside. Sable made eggs. Webb ate them slowly in the armchair. Lena sat near the window at an angle that let her watch the street without being visible from it. She had called Forte directly after calling Park and explained the repositioning, and Forte had not been happy. His version of unhappy was a very controlled, very precise articulation of the risks and his professional objection to them, and then had done what she asked, which was what mattered. 8 minutes past 10, a car came down the street. It was a gray sedan, nondescript, Montana plates. It slowed in front of Sable's house, did not stop. It continued to the end of the block, turned, and came back. On the second pass, it pulled to the curb. A man got out, medium build, plain clothes, carrying a document folder. He walked to the porch with the even pace of someone who had rehearsed the approach. Lena texted Park now. She stayed at the window. She watched the man ring the doorbell. She watched Sable open the door. She watched the conversation. The man produced a document from the folder, offered it with the body language of someone extending a courtesy rather than making a demand. Sable took it, looked at it, began reading it very carefully. The man waited on the porch. He was still waiting 4 minutes later when 2 vehicles turned onto the block from opposite ends simultaneously, and 3 people in civilian clothes, who moved with the specific economy of people who had done this before, crossed the lawn from 2 different directions, and the man on Sable's porch looked up from where he had been watching the front door and had approximately 2 seconds to what was happening before the situation was entirely outside his control. She watched him reach for his phone. One of the civilian-dressed figures was faster. She turned from the window. Webb was watching her. Face was tired, and his arm was wrong, and his dish towel sling was not doing enough, and he looked like a man who had spent the night making decisions in a hospital room, and the morning in a car, and the last hour in an armchair eating eggs he didn't want. They have him, she said. Webb closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Good. Your arm needs to be imaged today. I know. Not tomorrow, today. I heard you the first time, Lena. He opened his eyes. I'll go back. Park called 17 minutes later. The man on the porch is a private investigator out of Denver named Callum Reese, Park said. Contracted by a holding company. We're pulling the holding company now. But the contract structure goes predictably through a logistics consulting firm. Voss's firm. Reese have the fabricated statement on him. In the folder, yes, unsigned as expected. A pause. Also on him. And this is the part that took us a minute to process a second document. Printed email chain. Addressed to Garrett Voss. From a Hargrove County Medical Center internal email address. She went still. The email chain, Park said carefully, is a series of communications between Voss and the coordinator. 12 exchanges over 4 months. The coordinator's hospital email address is in the header of everyone. He paused. The email address belongs to Sandra Pell. Why did Reese have it? We think Voss gave it to him as leverage. A way to pressure Pell if she tried to walk back her involvement. Park's voice was flat. It's not an unusual move. You keep evidence of a co-conspirator's participation to ensure their continued cooperation. Reese probably didn't know what he was carrying. She looked at the wall of Sable's living room and thought about Sandra Pell at the intake desk, processing transfer information, watching the board, feeding a 4-month trail of data through a chain that ended in this house, in this city, with a man on a porch holding a fabricated statement. Pell, she said. Being picked up now, Park said. Hospital security is holding her pending federal arrival. She's not taking it well. There was something carefully neutral in that last phrase that she didn't push on. The email chain, she said. It's direct communication between her and Voss. 12 exchanges. Specific data patient intake times. Staff rotations you're scheduling on the trauma floor. One exchange references a specific date in August where she confirmed Webb's intake data within 90 minutes of his arrival. Park paused. And one exchange from 6 weeks ago, before you started at Hargrove, where Voss asks her to confirm that the subject has been placed. The subject. She had been placed. She had taken the job at Hargrove County Medical Center because it was a trauma floor rotation in a remote location that nobody paid much attention to, and she had believed she had found it through the ordinary process of searching for positions and applying and being hired. 6 weeks ago she had moved to Dunmore, Montana, and thought she had found a quiet place. Quiet place had been prepared for her. Voss positioned me, she said. We think so. The job listing, the interview process, we're pulling those records now. But the timeline suggests the Hargrove position was created to receive you. Park's voice was careful. Someone we're not sure yet if it was Voss directly or through another layer. Someone flagged that you were looking for positions in the region and moved to have you placed in a facility where Pell was already embedded. She sat down. She sat down in Sable's living room in the hardback chair near the window, which was unusual, because she had not sat down involuntarily in a long time. Quiet life she had built, the broken elevator, the east stairwell, the coffee she drank too fast in the mornings, Gerald, in room 11. The 6 weeks of being treated like background noise. None of it had been accidental. She had walked into a position that had been built to contain her, monitored by a person at the intake desk who had been reporting on her movements for longer than she had been working at that desk. The lamp beside Webb's armchair was the particular amber of cheap hotel lighting. Outside, Sable's birch tree moved in the September wind. Somewhere on the street, Callum Reese was in the back of a vehicle, and somewhere at Hargrove County Medical Center, Sandra Pell was not taking it well. The records request, she said. Fort Erickson. Where are we? JAG processed the expedited pathway this morning. They have your signature from last night. A pause. Preliminary confirmation came back an hour ago. The batch codes match. The 3 authorization documents in the secondary repository are the originals. Voss's fabrications are confirmed as fabrications by a 4-character discrepancy in the processing batch that cannot be replicated retroactively. Park's voice changed slightly, the flatness lifting just enough to notice. Your authorization was real, Lena. Every decision you made during Kelvin was documented, approved, and filed correctly. It always was. She looked at her hands. She knew that. She had always known that. But there was a specific kind of exhaustion in having to prove something that was never false, in having to chase the shape of your own record through a system that someone had deliberately broken, and the confirmation landed with a weight she hadn't fully anticipated. I need the formal documentation, she said. Before Mercer's 5 days are up. Fort Erickson is preparing the certified copies now. Forte will have them in hand by end of day. Park paused. We'll send them to Mercer directly with the full chain of custody. Forte's office will contact him. Good. There's one more thing. Park's voice had the careful texture again. Boss, we know where he is. She looked up from her hands. He's been in Dunmore, Park said, for the last 4 days. Came in 2 days before Webb's accident on Route 9. A pause. He's been staying at a motel on the south side of town. We've had surveillance on him since this morning. He doesn't know. Thought about Voss in a motel room in Dunmore, Montana. 4 days of patience. Watching the mechanism he had built play out. The archive pull. The fabricated documents. The journalist. Pell at the intake desk. Reese and Billings with a fabricated statement and leveraged documents in a folder. All of it moving on a timeline that Voss had set. And Voss had managed from a motel 6 miles from the hospital where Lena had been working her assigned rooms. What does Forty want to do, she said. Federal jurisdiction on the archive tampering and the records fabrication. He's coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver. Park paused. But Voss doesn't know the net has closed. He's waiting to hear from Reese. Reese, who was in the back of a vehicle. Reese, who had not made a call. How long before Voss realizes something went wrong, she said. Could be hours. Could be less. Park's voice had an edge of something she recognized, not excitement, because Park did not get excited, but the particular focus that preceded an operation reaching its terminal phase. Forte wants to move on him today. Before he hears anything in rabbits. Forte need me for that? No, he has everything he needs. A pause. He said to tell you, and I'm quoting, that the certified repository documents will be available by end of business today, and that your military record will be formally corrected through the JAG office within 48 hours. She looked at Webb, who had been listening to her side of the conversation with the focused patience of a man who had learned to reconstruct situations from partial information. Move on, Voss, she said to Park. Tell Forte I said go. She hung up. Webb was watching her. The dish towel sling looked even more improvised in Sable's living room light. He had eaten the eggs he didn't want and driven 2 hours on a compromised arm and sat in an armchair for 90 minutes while someone tried to fabricate a statement from the man in the next room, and his face had the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular word for a very long time. It's done, she said. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the window, at the birch tree moving in the wind, at the ordinary street where nothing unusual was happening anymore. "The job at Hargrove," he said finally. "You know it wasn't real." "I know. What are you going to do?" She thought about room 11 and Gerald. Thought about the yellow tag on room 4, the hard, warm calf, the D-dimer result that nobody had been paying enough attention to. She thought about the east stairwell that smelled like something was in the wall, and the broken elevator, and the coffee she drank too fast. She thought about a trauma bay, and a man on a gurney, and a room full of people who had already made their decision. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. Webb nodded like that was the right answer. Outside, Forte's people were collecting the pieces of a 4-month construction project and preparing to deliver them to a federal jurisdiction, and in a motel on the south side of Dunmore, Garrett Voss was still waiting to hear from a man who was not going to call. And in the certified document system at Fort Erickson, 3 authorization files sat with their correct batch codes intact, waiting to be copied and signed and delivered to a journalist who had given them 5 days and was about to receive everything he needed in 2. Everything Voss had built was coming apart at the precise seams he had designed it to look seamless. But Lena was not looking at any of that. She was looking at her phone, where a message had just arrived from a Hargrove County Medical Center. Internal number she recognized. It was from the nursing floor station. It was from Patricia Dunn. It said, "Room 11, Gerald. Code called 3 minutes ago, looking for the nurse who was with him yesterday." She was already moving when she finished reading the message. "I have to go," she said. And she was at Sable's front door before the sentence was fully out. Car keys in her hand, phone in her jacket pocket. Particular shift happening in her body that happened when the situation changed, and the response had to change with it. Not panic, not adrenaline exactly, but the narrowing of everything irrelevant until only the next correct action remained. Webb called after her. "Lena, stay in that chair," she said, and pulled the door shut behind her. She drove back to Dunmore in an hour and 40 minutes, which was faster than she should have driven and slower than she wanted to. She called the floor station twice. The first time, the unit coordinator picked up and told her Gerald had been stabilized, a cardiac event, suspected arrhythmia. The code team had responded, and he was in acute care now. The second time, Patricia Dunn picked up and said, in a voice that had lost most of its professional distance, "He was asking for you before they moved him." He kept saying the quiet nurse. He wanted the quiet nurse. She did not say anything to that. She kept driving. The mountains came down on both sides of the highway, and the sky was doing the thing it did in Montana in September, huge and very blue, and completely indifferent to the urgency of whatever was happening beneath it, and she drove through it with both hands on the wheel and the secure channel device sitting silent in her pocket, and tried not to think about Gerald asking for the quiet nurse while the code team worked on him. She parked in the hospital structure at 11:52 and went through the east entrance and up the stairwell, still smelling like something in the wall, and pushed through the second-floor doors and went directly to the acute care bay where Gerald had been moved. He was awake. That was the first thing she registered, and the relief of it was physical, a loosening somewhere in the chest that she had not known was tight. He was awake, propped on a slight incline, connected to a cardiac monitor that was showing a rhythm she assessed in under 2 seconds as stable and currently behaved. He looked smaller in the acute care bed than he had in room 11. People often did after a code. The machinery around them made them look like they were on loan to the equipment rather than the other way around. He saw her in the doorway. "There she is," he said. His voice was rougher than yesterday, but it was his voice. She came to the bedside. She checked the monitor. She looked at his color, his breathing rate, the quality of his alertness. The resident who had ordered the room 4 Doppler eventually was standing at the foot of the bed with a chart, and he looked at Lena with a different expression than he had been using all week. Something more careful, something that was adjacent to deference, if not quite there yet. "Potassium came back low this morning," the resident said. "His overnight draw. The night team caught it, but it wasn't flagged as urgent." She looked at him. "I know," he said before she could say anything. "I know." She looked at Gerald. "How do you feel?" "Like my heart tried to leave without me and got talked back." He paused. "Did they tell you what I said before they moved me? That you wanted the quiet nurse. That's not exactly." He stopped. "Try it again." "I said I want the nurse who actually looked at me. That's what I said." His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the person is working to keep them that way. Apparently that needed clarifying. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat in it, which she did not always do, but she had been in a car for most of the morning, and Gerald had just had a cardiac event and was telling her something that deserved the small courtesy of not being delivered to from a standing position. "The potassium," she said. "Yesterday morning. I flagged it." "I know you did," the young doctor told me. Gerald looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I'm not blaming anybody. I just wanted to say you saw it. You saw it and you said something, and somebody didn't listen closely enough, and here I am." He looked back at her. "But you saw it, for all the good it did. You're here, aren't you?" He said it simply, without drama. "Somebody called you, and you came back. That's not nothing." She looked at the cardiac monitor. The rhythm was holding. His rate was within acceptable parameters, and his pressure was better than it had been at admission, and the potassium replacement was running through his IV at the correct rate, and he was going to be all right. Probably was the best prognosis available in most situations, and better than it could have been. "I'm going to make sure your overnight draws get flagged appropriately going forward," she said. "I believe you." She stood up. She had other things to do the floor. Forte, Mercer, the documentation that was coming from Fort Erickson, and Gerald needed rest, not a nurse sitting in the corner chair. "Quiet nurse," Gerald said as she was reaching the door. "I didn't mean it as an insult when I said it the first time. I know. I meant you're the kind of quiet that's actually listening." He settled back into the pillow. "That's rarer than people think." She went back to the floor. The rest of that day moved in a way that was both very fast and very strange. The way days move when large things are resolving in the background, while the ordinary foreground continues to demand attention. She took her rooms back. She updated Gerald's chart with a detailed monitoring note that made the flagging requirement explicit and documented. She checked room 3, room 7, and 2 new admissions that had come in during the morning. She did her job in the way. She always did her job with the particular attention that Gerald had named correctly, even if she would not have named it the same way. 2:15, Forte called. "Bus is in federal custody," he said. "Arrested at the motel at 12:47. He came quietly, which I'll admit surprised me." She was in the medication room, counting a controlled substance inventory. Kept counting. What did he have on him? A laptop with the full fabrication project, the document processing software, correspondence with Pell, with Reese, with Falk, communications with the journalist's source chain. Forte's voice was flat and precise. "It is, I will say, a comprehensive record of his own criminal activity. Kept meticulous notes. He was building a case," she said. "Thought he was the one building a case." "Yes, which makes the evidence against him considerably easier to organize." A pause. "Falk is cooperating." She retained an attorney at 8 this morning, and the attorney advised cooperation. So we're getting her full account of the archive access, the file path, all of it." Another pause. "Reese is also cooperating, largely because he claims credibly that he didn't know the document in his folder was fabricated. He thought he was serving a civil affidavit." And Pell. The pause was slightly longer. "Pell initially denied knowledge of the substance of what she was providing," Forte said. "She maintained that she had been providing general scheduling information to a former hospital board consultant, which she claimed she believed was a legitimate consulting arrangement." He stopped. "Then we showed her the email chain, the one Reese was carrying. A beat. Stopped denying things after that. She finished the count and initialed the log. Charges: federal records tampering, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of a military records process, and for Voss specifically the Route 9 incident. We're treating that as attempted interference with a federal witness, which carries its own weight." Forte's voice was the most she had ever heard it approach satisfaction, and it was still very controlled. His attorney is going to have a difficult few months. The journalist: "We sent Mercer the full certified package from Fort Erickson at 1300. Batch codes, chain of custody documentation, the original authorization records with metadata verification, and a summary of the fabrication analysis." A pause. "Called my office at 1340 to confirm receipt," he said. Forte stopped briefly. He said he wanted to apologize for the inconvenience, which I thought was an unusual word choice, given the circumstances, but I took it in the spirit it was offered. Thought about Mercer in the diner, with his glasses pushed up on his forehead. A careful man. A man who had been handed a well-built lie, and had been careful with it, and had been willing to stop and look when she asked him to. That was not nothing either. His original story, she said. Is it dead? completely. He told my office he's writing a different story now. Something about the fabrication itself, how the operation was constructed, what it reveals about vulnerabilities in classified archive systems. Forte paused. He asked if you'd be willing to speak on background. She thought about that for a moment. Tell him I'll think about it, she said. She hung up and went back to the floor. Patricia Dunn was at the nursing station when she came through. Patricia looked up, and there was a quality to the look that had not been there a week ago. Something that was not quite apology and not quite acknowledgement, but was somewhere in the territory between them, where most genuine reckonings live. Gerald's potassium protocol has been updated, Patricia said. Put a standing flag on his chart for overnight draws. Good. Patricia stopped. Started again. The review that was open this morning. About the trauma bay intervention, Dr. Solis asked for it to be closed. He submitted an amended incident report. She held Lena's gaze. Documents that you correctly identified a compressive vascular injury that the surgical team had missed. Documents that the arm is intact as a direct result. A pause. He filed it as a commendation, not a complaint. Lena absorbed that. It landed differently than she expected, not as vindication exactly, but as something quieter and more specific. Accurate record. That was what Solis had said he was filing. Just the accurate record. I'll note it, Lena said. Voigt. Patricia's voice dropped slightly. The men who came yesterday. Federal arrest this morning. The journalist who was here. She stopped. I don't know what all of it was, and I've decided I'm not going to ask. But I want you to know that I'm sorry for the things I said. About staying in your lane. She looked uncomfortable with the apology, which made it more genuine. You were never in the wrong lane. Lena looked at her for a moment. Patricia Dunn was a difficult woman who had spent 11 years running a floor well and had spent the last 2 days in a situation her 11 years had not prepared her for, and she was standing at the nursing station, making an apology that cost her something, which was the only kind worth making. I appreciate that, Lena said. She meant it the same way she had meant the thank you the previous morning fully, in a way that didn't need to be elaborated. Patricia nodded once and went back to her clipboard. Afternoon continued. At 4 o'clock, Dr. Solis found her in the hallway outside room 3 and walked beside her for a few steps in the way of someone who has something to say and is deciding how to start. I want to propose something, he said. All right. I've been talking with administration about a training gap we've had for a while. In field medicine, the kind of pattern recognition that doesn't come from textbooks. Blast injury physiology, compressive vascular presentations, mass casualty triage sequencing. He paused. Kind of things that someone with your specific background would know. Kept walking. He kept pace. There's a structure for it, he said. A formal program. We've had the proposal sitting with administration for 18 months and couldn't find the right person to lead it. The hospital would need to create a new position, clinical instructor, trauma response. It would sit alongside your nursing role, not replace it. He glanced at her. It would mean your knowledge stops belonging only to you. Thought about what Gerald had said. You're the kind of quiet that's actually listening. She thought about what that kind of quiet cost and what it produced, and whether there was a version of her life in Dunmore where the quiet was a choice she kept making rather than a wall she was keeping up. Thought about the trauma bay, about the arm, about all the things she had seen and done and known that had lived only in her hands and her instincts, benefiting only the specific people who happened to be in her specific rooms on her specific shifts. I'd want to design the curriculum, she said. I assumed you would. Keep my floor rotations. I'm not leaving direct patient care. The proposal accounts for that. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him, this precise, silver-haired surgeon who had been about to amputate a man's arm and who had then filed an accurate report because that was what he was supposed to do, not because he enjoyed being corrected, and who was now standing in a hospital corridor proposing to build something. All right, she said. Solis nodded. He almost smiled. Quite, but almost. I'll get you the proposal by end of week. He walked away, and she went back to her rooms. Marcus Webb returned to Hargrove County Medical Center at 4:47 in the afternoon, driven by one of Forte's people in considerably worse condition than he had left it. He had the look of a man who had spent a significant portion of the last several hours regretting several decisions, and his dish towel sling had been replaced by an actual sling that someone had found for him, which was an improvement, but only in the most relative sense. Solis met him at the trauma bay entrance. Lena was there too, because she had been informed of his arrival. And because there were things that needed to be said and she intended to say them before the clinical machinery took over. She looked at Webb's arm. The swelling had increased not dramatically, but measurably. The decompression site was angry around the edges in a way that meant it had been stressed more than it should have been. "You need imaging," she said. "I know. And you need to stay in the bed this time." "I know that too. I'm serious, Marcus." He looked at her when she used his name, which she almost never did, and something moved through his expression: exhaustion, and something older than exhaustion. Kind of thing that accumulates in people who have spent a long time making decisions in the dark and only occasionally see the result of them in the light. "Voss is in custody," she said. "Park told me in the car." He paused. "The authorization documents. Confirmed and certified. Forte's office has copies. Mercer has copies. The JAG record correction is in process." She looked at him steadily. "Every decision you authorized during Kelvin is documented. Every decision I made under that authorization is documented. It was always documented." He just hid the documentation. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I should have found it faster," he said. "When Forte's team first flagged the archive irregularity, I should have moved faster. You moved as fast as the information allowed. That's a generous read. It's the accurate one." She said it the same way Solis had said it, not as comfort, but as the plain thing. "Came to warn me personally because you didn't trust the channels. That's why you were on Route 9. You were protecting a member of your unit, former member." "Unit doesn't have a former," she said, which was something he had told her once, a long time ago, in a different context, and she watched him receive it back. He looked at Solis. "Am I going back in the room?" "You're going back in the room," Solis confirmed. Webb went, with the particular gait of a man managing pain that he is not going to mention, and Solis went with him, and Lena watched them go and then went back to her floor and finished her shift. She left the hospital at 7:10 in the evening. Parking structure was quiet, and the air had gone cold, the way Montana air goes cold in September, fast final, like a door closing. She sat in the car for a moment before starting it. Phone showed 3 messages. One from Park Clean on our end. "Falk testimony filed. Forte says thank you, I know. I was surprised too." And one from Fort Erickson. Formal notification that her military service record had been submitted for correction through the JAG office and would reflect the complete and accurate documentation of the Kelvin deployment within 48 hours. The third message was from a number she didn't recognize, and it was 2 sentences. "Reviewed the full package from Forte's office. For the record, I'm sorry it took that much to show me what was actually there. Mercer." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she put the phone in her bag and started the car. She drove home through the dark and the mountains and thought about nothing in particular, which was something she was not good at and had been trying to learn. The apartment was the same gray carpet, windows facing the parking lot, the coffee maker on the counter. She changed out of her scrubs. She made tea instead of coffee, because it was late enough that coffee would keep her awake, and she stood at the counter with the mug and looked at the parking lot through the window and thought about everything that had happened in 6 weeks. She had come to Dunmore to be nobody. She had not known, when she accepted the position, that the position had been created for her, that somewhere in a logistics consultant's planning documents, her name appeared under the heading of subject placed, as though she were a piece in a configuration that someone else was managing. She had not known that the quiet life she thought she was choosing was a quiet life that had been built around her like a room with no exits, designed to hold her in place, while the fabrication work was completed. That was the part she had been sitting with since Park told her, and would probably keep sitting with for a while. Part that was not comfortable was this: she had been watched, and she had not known it. She had been managed, and she had not seen it. She had spent 6 weeks believing she had made a choice, when the choice had been made adjacent to her, without her knowledge. For someone who had spent 14 months in environments where situational awareness was the difference between outcomes you could live with and outcomes you couldn't, that was a thing she was going to have to work through, honestly, rather than fold away. She was not perfect. She had been fooled. Not completely. She had seen Mercer at the nursing station and understood the shape of the problem faster than Voss had planned for. She had signed the records request and made the call and driven to Billings on the right instinct. But she had also spent 6 weeks in a surveillance net and walked through it every morning, thinking she was free. That was human. It was the part of being human that nobody advertised, that even the people with the best training and the sharpest instincts had days, or weeks, or months, where someone else was seeing more than they were. And the only honest response to that was not to pretend it hadn't happened, but to look at it directly and decide what it meant going forward. It meant she was going to be more careful. It meant she was going to trust the people who had earned it and stop performing self-sufficiency, as though needing support was the same as being weak. It meant that the next time Park said, "I'll hold for 1 hour," she was going to say thank you instead of just hanging up. Small things. True things. She finished the tea and rinsed the mug and went to the desk and opened her laptop. Garrett Voss's arrest had made a regional news brief by early evening federal records tampering, conspiracy, 2 co-conspirators in custody. The case referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver. The language was dry and procedural in the way that legal proceedings are when they're reported before the full scope is understood. No mention of her name, no mention of Kelvin, no mention of a classified archive or a journalist who had almost published a story that was not a story. That would change. Mercer was going to write something eventually, and when he did, it would be more accurate than what he had almost published, and it would be fair. She believed that, based on what she had seen of him, and she would be in it. She had spent 2 years not wanting to be in anything. Thought about what Solis had said. Your knowledge stops belonging only to you. She had chosen the kind of quiet that was actually listening, as Gerald had put it. She had chosen it for reasons that had partly been about protecting herself and partly been about believing that what she knew and what she had done were best kept small, kept close, not used up by an institution that would categorize them and schedule them and put them on a curriculum document. But Gerald was alive because she had flagged a potassium level and kept watching. Marcus Webb had both his arms because she had stepped forward when the room was still laughing. And she had stepped forward not because she had calculated the risk or been given permission or decided the moment was appropriate. She had stepped forward because the information in her head said the arm isn't dead and saying nothing would have been a different kind of damage. You cannot know what you know and choose not to use it. Not really. Not without paying a cost that compounds quietly in the dark. She closed the laptop. She thought about the training program, curriculum she would design: field vascular injuries, mass casualty triage sequencing, the specific pattern recognition that came from having made decisions in conditions where the usual systems were not available, and the patient in front of you was the only reference point. She thought about the residents who had laughed in the trauma bay and who were now presumably not laughing. She thought about Dr. Farr with his automatic laugh and his careful subsequent silence and what it might look like to teach him to see a hematoma before it cost someone an arm. She was not going to be gracious about it. She was going to be demanding and precise, and occasionally difficult, because the knowledge she was going to transfer did not survive being softened, and the people who needed it deserved the version that was real rather than the version that was comfortable. That was the job. 48 hours later, the formal JAGI notification arrived. Her military service record had been corrected. The Kelvin deployment was fully documented. Chief Warrant Officer Lena Voigt's record reflected the complete and accurate account of every decision made under emergency field protocol, with all 3 authorization documents restored to the archive and cross-referenced to the secondary repository filing. The accumulation of events that Voss had spent 4 months constructing had in its entirety become evidence against him rather than against her. The forensic analysis of his fabricated documents was submitted as prosecution exhibits. Falk's testimony described the archive access plan in detail that made the conspiracy timeline visible from beginning to end. Reese's account of the Sable approach established the overt act that gave the federal case its clearest charge. Sandra Pell, operating under a cooperation agreement that her attorney had negotiated with some urgency, provided the internal hospital communications that documented her role in tracking Lena's movements and Webb's transfer data. The case did not go to trial quickly, because federal cases rarely did, but the outcome of the pretrial proceedings was not seriously in doubt, because Voss's meticulous record-keeping had been, in the end, the most thorough documentation of his own culpability that any prosecutor could have hoped for. Mercer published in October. The piece was about the vulnerability of classified archive systems to targeted document removal, and it used the Voss operation as a case study, and it described in careful and accurate terms the way a fabrication could be built to survive its own exposure. It mentioned, in 2 paragraphs near the end, that the intended target of the operation had identified the document gap, initiated the records retrieval process, and provided the information that allowed investigators to intercept the fabricated Sable statement before it could be submitted. It did not use the word hero. Mercer was too careful a writer for that. What it said was that the person most at risk had also been the one who closed the net, which was accurate and which she found, when she read it, to be enough. Webb came back to say goodbye on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the arrest. He was in uniform, the first time she had seen him in uniform in 2 years, and his arm was in a proper sling now, the kind that Solis had approved, and he walked down the second-floor corridor of Hargrove County Medical Center with the measured gait of someone whose arm still hurt and who was not going to let it show, which was so consistent with every version of him she had ever known that it almost made her smile. Stopped in front of her at the nursing station. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're staying," he said. "I'm staying. The training program starts in January." She picked up a chart. Solis is already complaining about the curriculum length. Good. He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I always knew you'd land somewhere that mattered." "This was always somewhere that mattered," she said. "Just had to stop hiding in it." He held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man who had many things to say and had decided to say none of them, which was its own kind of communication between people who had worked together long enough to not require the words. Then he stood straight and saluted. Not the half gesture of someone being informal. Not the one he had given from the gurney, trembling, desperate, the signal of a man using the last of something to reach across a room. This one was the full and correct version. Thumb tucked, fingers flat, wrist locked. Kind that meant something specific about who was giving it and why and what it had cost to get to the place where it could be given. Stood at the nursing station in her scrubs with her name badge clipped at her collar and looked at Marcus Webb in his uniform and felt the weight of it, not the military ceremony of it. The human weight of being seen correctly by someone who knew the whole picture. She returned it. Not because protocol required it, because he had earned it and she had earned it, and the salute was the only shape that contained what needed to be said without reducing it to something smaller. He dropped his hand, nodded once. "Take care of yourself, Chief. Take care of that arm, Colonel." He walked back down the corridor, and she watched him go, and then she turned back to the chart and updated the notation she had been writing before he arrived. Because the floor did not pause for the moments that deserved pausing, and she had learned a long time ago to carry the important things and keep moving. 3 months later, the second-floor training room at Hargrove County Medical Center had a wall-mounted whiteboard covered in anatomical diagrams that she had drawn herself, not the clean textbook versions, but the field versions, the ones with the variations marked, the ones that showed what compression looked like when you couldn't see it from the surface, and had to know it from everything else. The residents came on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Some of them came ready to argue, which she encouraged. Some of them came ready to perform, knowing things they didn't know, which she dismantled quickly and without cruelty, but without apology either. Farr came every session. He sat in the front, which was something she had not expected, and he took notes on actual paper rather than a tablet, and he had not laughed at anything in 3 months. Once, after a session on compressive vascular injury, he had stayed behind and stood at the whiteboard, looking at the diagram she had drawn, and said, "I would have seen it. Eventually. I want you to know that." She had looked at him. "Maybe," she said. "But eventually is a long time on a surgical clock." He had nodded. That was all. But he had come back Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and he was starting to ask the questions that meant he was thinking in the right direction, which was the only thing the training was actually for. Gerald had been discharged after 12 days. He had come to find her before he left, which had required him to walk the full length of the second floor in a hospital gown and slippers, which his daughter, who had arrived from Phoenix on day 2, had loudly objected to, and which he had ignored. He stood in the doorway of room 7, which she happened to be in, and he said, "I told my daughter about the quiet nurse. She wants to send you something. She doesn't have to do that. I know she doesn't. She's going to anyway." He looked at her in the room with its monitor and its bed and its window that faced the parking structure. "Staying here? I'm staying." He nodded like that, settled something. "Good. This place needs people who actually look." She had not said anything to that, because there was nothing to say to it that would improve it. The training room did not have her name on the door. She had not asked for that. What it had was the whiteboard, and the chairs, and the Tuesday-Thursday schedule, and a sign-in sheet that had, by January, more names on it than the room had been designed to hold, because word had gotten through the resident rotation response that the trauma response sessions were the ones where you actually learned something you couldn't find in a textbook. That was enough. That was more than enough. She had not come to Dunmore to be found. She had come to be no one, to be the quiet nurse in room 7, the one nobody learned the name of, the one who flagged potassium levels and moved through corridors without taking up too much space. She had been so committed to smallness that she had walked into a surveillance net and lived in it for 6 weeks and thought she was free. The thing about what you know is that it does not stay small just because you tell it to. Finds the exits. It steps forward in trauma bays when the room is still laughing. Drives to Billings on the right instinct. It signs records requests at midnight because the alternative is watching someone else's lie become the only version of the story. Cannot know what you know and choose silence permanently. Not without cost. Not without the kind of damage that shows up years later in ways you can't name and weren't expecting. What you can do what Lena Voigt had done, imperfectly, with wrong turns and a 6-week blind spot and more stubbornness than was probably medically advisable, was find the place where the silence ended and decide to mean something in it. She stood at the whiteboard on a Tuesday afternoon with a room full of residents and drew the anatomy of a compressive injury from memory. Not the clean version, the real one, the variations marked and the failure points labeled, and she did not make it easier than it was, because the people in front of her were going to face the real version in rooms without warning, and they deserved to be ready. She had been invisible for 6 weeks. Not anymore. Not because someone had decided she mattered. Because she had stopped agreeing that she didn't.